Welcome back to our quiet corner of history. Thank you for resting here with us once again. Before we let the echoes of the past wash over us, I want to gently invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It costs nothing at all, but it helps our peaceful community grow, allowing us to continue crafting these long, calming journeys for you. And if you find comfort here and wish to help us keep the stories flowing, we humbly accept donations at ko-fi.com/history to relax. The link is resting in the description below. Now, wherever you are, make yourself comfortable. Let your eyes grow heavy. Take a deep, slow breath in, filling your lungs, and let it out softly. Let your shoulders drop, releasing the weight of the day. We are going to travel very far back tonight, back to the dawn of human memory. Imagine a world completely untouched by artificial light. A world where the only glow came from the pale moon, the distant scatter of stars, and the sun that ruled the day. For the earliest ancestors of humanity, wandering the vast, open savannas of ancient Earth, the setting of the sun was a time of deep vulnerability. The night was not a time of comfort or leisure. It was a time of quiet survival, when the sky turned a bruised purple and then faded to a heavy, absolute black. The temperature would drop. The air grew sharp and biting. The shadows stretched out across the tall grass, hiding the unknown. Without a way to see in the dark, early humans could only rely on their hearing. They listened to the rustling leaves, the snap of dry branches, and the distant echoing calls of massive predators, creatures that own the night. They huddled close together in trees or shallow caves, sharing the fragile warmth of their bodies, waiting patiently, silently, for the morning light to return and chase the terrifying shadows away. But nature, in all its wild power, occasionally offered a glimpse of a different kind of light. Sometimes, during the heavy rolling thunderstorms of the dry season, a brilliant, jagged flash of lightning would tear the sky in half. It would strike an old, dead tree with a sound that shook the very ground. And when the rain eventually stopped and the thick clouds parted, something incredible was left behind in the damp earth. A glowing, dancing, orange spirit. At first, this wildfire must have been entirely terrifying to early humans. It was a beast of pure energy. It was hot, and it was hungry. It consumed the dry grass and the fallen branches with a loud, crackling roar, turning solid wood into weightless grey ash. It bit those who reached out too quickly. But as the wild flames slowly died down, exhausted of fuel, leaving only a soft, pulsing bed of red embers on the ground, a few brave, curious souls stepped closer. They felt something they had only ever felt from the afternoon sun. Warmth, a deep, radiating heat pushing back the cold evening air. History does not record the name of the first ancient human who gathered the courage to interact with this glowing magic. But we know it happened hundreds of thousands of years ago. Imagine that profound, quiet moment. Someone, moving slowly, their eyes wide with awe, picked up a thick branch that was still smoldering at the end. They held this tiny, captive piece of the sun in their hands. They soon realized a simple, beautiful truth. If they fed it dry leaves, if they gave it small twigs, this bright, warm spirit would stay alive. For a very long time, our ancestors were simply foragers of fire. They did not know how to create it from nothing, so they had to borrow it from nature. When a wildfire passed, they would capture the embers. They learned to carry these precious coals in hollowed-out animal horns, or wrapped carefully in thick, damp leaves. It was a sacred duty. Keeping the ember alive as they walked across valleys and mountains meant the difference between life and death. If the ember went out, the cold and the dark would return. If we look deep into the earth, archaeologists have found the quiet remnants of this ancient relationship. In a place called Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, deep within the dark, cool stone, researchers found traces of burned bone and plant ash dating back roughly 1 million years. It is a silent whisper from the past, proving that early human ancestors, perhaps Homo erectus, had learned to bring the fire inside. Bringing the fire inside changed everything. The heavy, frightening darkness of the cave was suddenly pushed back. The fire created a safe, golden sphere of light in the middle of a dangerous wilderness. The great predators of the Ice Ages, the cave bears and saber-toothed cats, were afraid of the bright, dancing flames. They stayed far away, pacing in the shadows. For the first time in the history of our planet, humans did not have to hide in fear when the sun went down. And then the relationship deepened. Someone, somewhere, dropped a piece of raw meat or a tough, fibrous root near the glowing coals. When they retrieved it, it was transformed. It smelled rich and savory. It was soft. The invention of cooking was a quiet biological revolution. Raw food takes a massive amount of energy to chew and digest. But the fire acted like a second stomach, breaking down the tough fibers before the food even reached their mouths. Because eating cooked food was so much easier, over tens of thousands of years, human bodies began to change. Our jaws grew smaller, our digestive tracts grew shorter, and all that saved energy had to go somewhere. It went to our heads. The extra calories fueled the growth of the human brain, making it larger and more complex. We became smarter, simply because we sat around the fire and ate warm meals. But the final, most magical step in this journey was the leap from finding fire to making it. Imagine the immense patience it took. Perhaps it started by accident while shaping tools. A piece of flint striking against a stone containing iron pyrite, sending a bright, brief spark into a pile of dry moss. Or perhaps it was the friction of a wooden drill, spun rapidly between calloused hands against a softer piece of wood. Picture an ancient human, kneeling in the dirt, rubbing a wooden stick with total concentration. Their breath is steady. A tiny groove in the wood begins to darken. The smell of toasted pine fills the air. A thin, fragile wisp of white smoke curls upward. They stop rubbing, carefully cup the smoking dust in their hands, and blow on it, very gently. A soft, continuous breath, until suddenly, a bright yellow flame bursts into existence. In that single moment, humanity conquered the night. They were no longer waiting for the lightning. They were the makers of light. The fire brought us so many gentle, enduring gifts. The sharp, bitter cold of the winter wind could no longer freeze their spirits. They could sit near the hearth, rubbing their hands together, feeling the soothing, penetrating heat spread through their fingers and toes. The familiar smell of wood smoke filled the air, a scent that still, deep down in our DNA, brings us a feeling of comfort and home. But perhaps the most beautiful gift of the controlled fire was the time it gave us. Before the flame, the long nights were for sleeping or waiting in silence. But now, with a warm, living light dancing in the center of the camp, people stayed awake a little longer. The day was extended. They sat in a circle, looking at each other's faces glowing in the soft, flickering orange light. They listened to the hypnotic crackle and pop of the burning wood. In this quiet, safe space, surrounded by a wall of darkness, human culture truly began. In the glow of the campfire, the first tools were carefully carved and repaired for the next day's hunt. In the glow of the campfire, language grew from simple warnings into complex thoughts. They shared memories of the day. They warned each other of dangers. They looked up past the rising smoke, pointed at the endless sea of stars, and began to wonder about the nature of the world. The first myths, the first legends, the first bedtime stories were whispered around these ancient hearths. The fire became the heart of the community. It was a place of rest, a place of healing, and a place of belonging after a long, tiring day of walking across a harsh world. Even now, thousands of centuries later, when we sit quietly by a fireplace or watch the tiny, fragile flame of a candle on a bedside table, we feel a deep, ancient peace. Our bodies are remembering the safety of that very first light. We are recalling the simple, quiet comfort of knowing that the cold and the dark cannot reach us as long as the fire burns. And so, the glowing embers carried humanity forward. We were safe. We were warm. But as we sat safely in the light, our legs rested, and our minds began to wander. The world beyond the campfire was vast and wide, filled with heavy stones, large trees, and distant horizons. As communities grew, the heavy burdens of survival needed to be moved. We needed to carry more than our arms could hold. The fire gave us the safety to think and to dream. And from those quiet, fireside dreams, something new was beginning to take shape. A simple, round idea, born from rolling logs, that would soon start the world turning in a completely new way. From those quiet, fireside dreams, something new was beginning to take shape. A simple, round idea, born from rolling logs, that would soon start the world turning in a completely new way. As the centuries passed, the glowing embers of the campfire had given early humans a profound sense of safety. They had a place to rest. But humanity, at its very core, has always been restless. Even as we sat in the warm light, our eyes looked out into the shadows, and our minds wondered what lay beyond the next hill, across the wide valley, or on the other side of the towering mountains. We were wanderers. We moved to follow the herds of animals, to find fresh water, and to gather the fruits of the earth as the seasons gently turned. But traveling was heavy work. Moving an entire family, an entire tribe, meant carrying everything you owned on your own back. Imagine the sheer physical exhaustion of those early journeys. The heavy animal hides used for tents, the stone tools, the dried food, the young children who were too tired to walk. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. At first, our ancestors tried to cheat the weight of the world by building sledges. They would tie strong branches together, place their heavy burdens on top, and drag them across the dirt. You can almost hear the rough, scraping sound of wood dragging over dry earth and stone. It was a slow, agonizing pull. The earth resisted every inch. Friction was an invisible enemy, holding them back, making their muscles ache and their hands blister. But humans are observant. If you spend enough time walking through the ancient forests, you notice how the world naturally moves. Perhaps it happened after a great storm, when a massive ancient tree was struck down by the wind. A group of hunters, trying to move the fallen trunk out of their path, pushed against it, and instead of scraping painfully against the dirt, it rolled. It moved smoothly, spinning over the ground with a quiet, satisfying rumble. This was the first whisper of a revolution, the concept of the roller. Soon, humans began placing smooth, round logs underneath their heavy sledges. It was a brilliant but exhausting puzzle. As the sledge rolled forward over the logs at the back would be left behind. People had to constantly stop, pick up the heavy back logs, run to the front, and lay them down again in the dirt to keep the sledge moving. It was a clumsy dance, a continuous tiring rhythm of picking up and putting down. It was better than dragging, but it was not yet true freedom. For thousands of years, this was the best we could do. The true wheel, the wheel that would change the course of human history, was still hiding in the future. And surprisingly, it did not begin on the long, dusty roads of travel. It began in the quiet, peaceful mud of an artisan's workshop. Let us travel forward to about 5,500 years ago, to the warm, fertile lands of ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Here, humans had begun to build the first great villages out of sun-baked mud. And in these villages, they needed vessels to hold their water, their grain, and their oils. Imagine an ancient potter sitting quietly in the shade of a clay brick wall. The afternoon sun is warm. The air smells of wet earth and river water. In front of them is a heavy, flat disc of wood or stone, balanced carefully on a small central pivot. The potter places a lump of wet grey clay perfectly in the center of the disc. With a gentle push of their hand, they set the disc spinning. It turns smoothly, silently in a circle. The potter dips their fingers in cool water and cups the spinning clay. Listen to the soft, wet sound of the mud sliding against human hands. Under the gentle, constant pressure of their fingers, the shapeless lump of earth magically rises. It hollows out. It becomes a perfect, symmetrical bowl. This was the potter's wheel. The very first time humanity harnessed a continuous spinning circle. It was an invention of art, of creation, and of quiet beauty. But the true genius of humanity is taking a beautiful idea from one place and applying it to another. Someone, somewhere in those ancient cities, looked at the potter's wheel spinning flat on the ground and tilted their head. What if we turned it on its side? What if the spinning disc did not shape clay, but conquered the long, dusty roads? It sounds so simple to us now, but inventing the wheel for transportation was one of the most difficult mechanical puzzles in human history. The magic was not just the wheel itself. The true magic was the axle. You see, for a wheel to carry a heavy load, it cannot simply roll free like a log. It must be attached to a stationary cart, but it must still be allowed to spin. The invention of the wheel and axle required extreme precision. Imagine the ancient carpenter carving a thick, solid disc out of a massive tree trunk. They had to carve a perfectly round hole exactly in the absolute center. If it was even slightly off center, the cart would violently bounce and shake. Then they had to carve a wooden pole, the axle, to fit inside that hole. If the fit was too tight, the wood would grind together, the friction would build, and it would not turn. If it was too loose, the wheel would wobble and snap under the weight. It had to be perfect, smooth, balanced, a delicate harmony between the moving edge and the still center. And when they finally found that perfect balance, the world changed. Imagine the very first time a wooden cart, loaded with heavy sacks of grain, was pulled forward by a strong ox. There was no more rough scraping, no more agonizing dragging. There was just a sudden, smooth release of tension. A new sound entered the world, the rhythmic, steady creak of wooden wheels turning on a dirt path. Creak, crunch, roll. It was a hypnotic, comforting sound. It was the sound of progress. It was the sound of distance disappearing. With the wheel, The world suddenly shrank. Villages that were once weeks apart were now only days apart. A farmer could grow more food than their family needed, load it onto a wooden wagon, and slowly roll it to a neighboring town to trade. Spices, fabrics, tools, and ideas began to travel along the twisting, dusty roads of the ancient world. The heavy burdens of life were lifted from our tired backs and placed onto the spinning wood. The wheel allowed us to connect our distant campfires. It allowed us to share our stories with people we had never met. And as we traveled further and explored the vastness of the earth on our turning wheels, we began to notice the rich, dark soil beneath our feet. We began to realize that we didn't always have to keep moving. The wheel had shown us the world, but it also helped us carry the heavy stones and timber needed to build permanent homes. We were tired of wandering. We looked at the wild, untamed fields, and we wondered if we could tame the fire, and if we could tame the heavy burden of travel. Could we also tame the earth itself? Could we convince the ground to give us food, so we could finally stay in one place, rest our wheels, and watch the seasons pass from the safety of a permanent home? The time for wandering was slowly coming to an end. It was time to turn the soil. The time for wandering was slowly coming to an end. It was time to turn the soil. For hundreds of thousands of years, the rhythm of human life was dictated by the wild, unpredictable whims of nature. We were foragers. We were hunters. We were eternal travelers, always scanning the horizon for the next meal. If the rains did not fall, the wild fruits would not grow. If the winters were too long, the herds of animals would move far away, leaving the ancient tribes in a quiet, desperate hunger. Every day was a question. Every morning began with a search. Imagine the deep, physical exhaustion of that uncertainty. Walking for miles under a burning sun just to find a handful of bitter roots or a small cluster of berries. The human spirit was strong, but our bodies were tired of the endless walking. We longed for a place to simply stop, a place to rest our turning wheels, to build a fire that we would not have to abandon the next day, and to know, with absolute certainty, that there would be food tomorrow. The answer to this ancient exhaustion was not found in the vastness of the horizon. It was found by looking down, right beneath our tired, calloused feet. It started with a silent observation, a profound realization of how the world breathes and grows. Perhaps it was a family returning to a valley they had camped in the year before. They noticed that where they had accidentally dropped the seeds of wild wheat around their old fire pit, a thick, green patch of new wheat had sprung up. It was a slow, quiet miracle. The realization that a seed, a tiny, hard, dry thing that looks completely lifeless, holds a sleeping giant inside. If you press it into the soft, dark mud, and if the sky gifts it with water, it will wake up. It will push a fragile, pale green ribbon up through the heavy dirt, reaching for the sun. Once we understood this secret, we were no longer just passengers on the earth. We became partners with it. But early farming was a brutal, back-breaking labor. To plant a seed, you must first break the tough, baked crust of the wild earth. Our ancestors used simple, pointed digging sticks. Picture a farmer, bent over in the hot sun, striking the hard ground with a sharpened branch, over and over again. They had to fight the deep, tangled roots of wild grasses and the hidden, stubborn stones. It was agonizing work. A single person could only scratch out a tiny patch of dirt in a whole day of labor. The food they grew was a blessing, but the cost was the aching of every muscle in their body. We needed a way to open the earth faster. We needed a tool that was stronger than human hands. And so, somewhere in the ancient, fertile valleys of the Middle East, human ingenuity took another massive, quiet leap forward. We took the simple, wooden digging stick and we made it larger. We carved a heavy piece of timber into a sharp, angled blade. And then, we looked to the gentle, massive animals that shared our world. The strong, patient oxen. We crafted leather harnesses and wooden yokes, resting them softly on the broad shoulders of these magnificent beasts. We attached the heavy wooden blade behind them, and with a gentle click of the tongue and a soft urging, the ox stepped forward. Imagine the sensory poetry of that very first ploughed field. Listen to the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the ox as it pulls. Hear the slow, steady creak of the wooden harness straining against the weight. And then, the sound of the plough itself. A deep, tearing sound as the sharp wooden blade slices through the ancient, tangled roots of the wild meadow. Behind the plough, the earth is magically opened. The hard, grey crust is peeled back, folding over in a long, continuous wave, revealing the rich, dark, damp soil underneath. The smell is intoxicating. It is the deep, mineral scent of overturned earth. It is the smell of buried moisture being exposed to the warm sun for the very first time. Even today, thousands of years later, when a farmer ploughs a field, or when we turn the soil in our own small gardens, that rich, dark scent fills us with a profound sense of peace. It is the smell of life. It is the promise of a coming harvest. As the plough cut its long, perfectly straight lines across the valleys, the wild, chaotic landscape was transformed into a place of gentle order. The plough allowed a single farmer to do the work of 50 men. Suddenly, the earth was willing to give us far more than we needed just to survive today. We grew fields of golden wheat, tall green barley, and sweet, resting vegetables. We gathered the harvest in the autumn, carrying the heavy baskets of grain back to our mud brick homes. For the first time in human history, we had a surplus. We had extra food. We built large, quiet, cool rooms to store the grain. And as the harsh winter winds howled outside, and the snow blanketed the frozen fields, humans sat comfortably inside. The fires were warm. The stomachs were full. The deep, ancient anxiety of starvation began to fade away into the shadows. Because we no longer had to spend every waking hour searching for food, we finally had the time to sit still, to breathe, to think. The plough did not just grow wheat, it grew human civilization. The small camps turned into permanent, sprawling villages. The villages grew into walled towns. People had time to become weavers, potters, builders, and musicians. We built temples to honor the changing of the seasons and the quiet magic of the rain. We watched the slow turning of the stars, learning to predict exactly when the spring would return to warm the soil once again. We had finally found a home. But with this new, complex life came a new challenge. As the storehouses filled with thousands of baskets of grain, and as the towns grew to hold thousands of people, our memories began to struggle. We needed to know exactly how much food we had saved for the winter. We needed to know who owned which piece of land. We needed to remember the laws we had made and the stories of our ancestors. The human mind is beautiful, but it forgets. A spoken word fades into the air the moment it is said. As we sat in our permanent homes, surrounded by the bounty of the earth, we realized we needed a way to make our thoughts visible. We needed a way to capture our fleeting voices and carve our memories into something that would last forever. We needed a way to capture our fleeting voices and carve our memories into something that would last forever. The spoken word is a deeply beautiful but fragile thing. When a mother sings a soft lullaby to a child in the dark, or when a wise elder shares a story around the glowing embers of a fire, the words hold immense power. But the very moment the sound leaves their lips, it begins to fade. It travels only as far as the air can carry it. It reaches only the ears of those sitting near enough to listen, and then it vanishes into silence. For the vast majority of our history, human memory was our only library. We held our entire world inside our minds. But memory, as we all know, is like water slipping quietly through our fingers. Details blur, names fade into the shadows of time. A story told over and over again, through dozens of generations, slowly changes its shape, like a stone smoothed by a river. As the ancient villages grew into sprawling, busy cities, surrounded by endless fields of plowed earth, the human mind simply could not hold it all. Imagine standing in the center of the ancient city of Uruk, thousands of years ago. The sun is bright and hot. The streets are filled with the sounds of thousands of people. Farmers are bringing in massive carts of barley. Shepherds are guiding flocks of hundreds of white sheep. Merchants are trading heavy jars of olive oil for copper tools. If you were a king or a temple priest, how could you possibly remember it all? If someone promised to give you 50 baskets of grain in exchange for 3 strong oxen, how could you prove it a month later, when the seasons had changed and memories had faded? We needed a way to freeze time. We needed a way to make a promise visible. The solution did not begin with poetry or epic tales of heroes. It began with the quiet, careful work of counting. Imagine a young temple worker, stepping away from the noise of the busy market. He walks down to the cool, quiet banks of the great Euphrates River. The water flows gently past. He reaches down and scoops up a handful of river mud. The clay is smooth, damp, and perfectly cool against his warm skin. He rolls it between his hands, patting it gently until it forms a small, flat cushion, just the right size to fit comfortably in the palm of his hand. Next, he takes a simple, hollow reed, cut from the tall green grasses swaying in the shallow water. With a sharp stone, he cuts the tip of the reed so that it forms a tiny, stiff triangle. He sits in the shade of a mud brick wall. He holds the soft clay in his left hand and the reed in his right. And then, he makes history. Listen to the soft, squishing sound as he presses the sharp tip of the reed into the wet earth. Press, lift, press, lift. He is not writing letters. He is drawing simple, tiny pictures. He draws a rough shape of a stalk of wheat. Next to it, he presses the tip of the reed into the clay 5 times, making 5 small, deep marks, 5 baskets of wheat. He sets the tablet down on a stone, directly in the path of the baking afternoon sun. As the hours pass, the heat of the sun slowly draws the moisture out of the earth. The soft, grey mud hardens. It turns to stone. The thought is now trapped. The numbers are frozen. Even if the young worker forgets, even if he passes away, the stone will remember. This simple act of pressing a reed into clay was a profound revolution. It was the birth of cuneiform, the world's first system of writing. But humans are deeply creative creatures. We are never satisfied with simply counting our wealth. We have feelings, we have dreams, we have complex thoughts that cannot be drawn as simple pictures. How do you draw a picture of love? How do you draw a picture of tomorrow? Slowly, over hundreds of years, The scribes sitting in their quiet, cool rooms realized something magical. The pictures did not just have to represent objects. They could represent the sounds of the human voice. By combining different marks, they could spell out a person's name. They could write down the laws of the city, pressing them into massive pillars of black stone for everyone to see. The voice was suddenly untied from the body. A king could write a command on a piece of clay, hand it to a messenger, and the messenger could ride a horse across a vast, silent desert for weeks. When the messenger handed the clay to a general in a distant land, the clay would speak the king's exact words, perfectly and silently, without the king ever opening his mouth. Distance was no longer an obstacle for human thought. But perhaps the most beautiful, comforting magic of written language is its ability to travel through time. Think about what it means to open a book today, or to read a letter from someone you love. You are staring at dark marks on a bright surface, but as your eyes move quietly over the shapes, a voice begins to play in your mind. You are hearing the thoughts of another human being. When archaeologists dig deep into the dry sands of the Middle East, they sometimes find ancient libraries, rooms filled with thousands of baked clay tablets, resting in the dark for over 4,000 years. When a scholar brushes away the dust and traces their finger over those tiny wedge-shaped marks, something miraculous happens. The silence of the centuries is broken. A voice from the ancient past speaks directly into their mind. They read the complaints of a tired merchant who bought bad copper. They read the gentle, loving words of a father giving advice to his young son. They read the grand, epic poems of kings who searched the edges of the earth for the secret to living forever. Through writing, we defeated death. The physical body may return to the earth, but the thoughts, the fears, and the loves of our ancestors remain perfectly preserved, waiting patiently for someone to read them. Writing allowed us to map the land, to record the movements of the stars, and to build massive empires of knowledge. It made us the masters of the solid ground. But human curiosity is a powerful, restless thing. As we stood on the shores of our great rivers and looked out at the vast, endless blue oceans stretching out to the horizon, we realized that our feet, our spinning wheels, and our quiet libraries could only take us so far. The deep water was a boundary, a massive, moving wall of blue. We could not walk on it. We could not pave it. But as we felt the invisible wind push against our faces, smelling the salt of the open sea, we began to wonder, what if we could ride the water, just as we had learned to ride the turning wheel? We needed to catch the invisible breath of the world. We needed to catch the invisible breath of the world. For thousands of years, the edge of the land was the end of the human story. We had conquered the heavy earth. We had tamed the fire. We had placed the heavy burdens of travel onto the spinning wheel. And we had opened the dark soil with the plow. We had even built quiet, cool libraries to hold our written memories. We were the masters of the solid ground. But when our ancient ancestors stood on the sandy shores and looked out across the endless rolling blue of the ocean, they felt very small. The water was a massive, breathing wall. It was a boundary that could not be paved, could not be farmed, and could not be marked. It moved constantly, shifting with the pull of the pale moon, the tides rising and falling like the chest of a sleeping giant. At first, we tried to cross the shallow waters using only the strength of our own bodies. We carved heavy, hollow boats out of massive tree trunks, and we pushed them into the rivers. We crafted long wooden paddles, and we fought the water. Imagine the deep, physical exhaustion of rowing a heavy wooden boat against a strong river current, the burning in the shoulders, the painful blisters on the hands, the sweat stinging the eyes under a hot, bright sun. A boat full of strong rowers could move across the water, but only for a short time. Eventually, the muscles fail. The arms grow heavy. You could only travel as far as your own body could endure, and you always had to keep the safe, brown line of the shore in sight. If you rowed too far out, the ocean would simply swallow you in its vastness. We were crawling on the water, but we wanted to fly. The secret to true freedom on the waves was not in the water at all. It was in the air. If you stand on a beach on a breezy afternoon, you can feel it. The invisible hand of the wind, pushing against your chest, rustling the fabric of your clothes, tossing the dry leaves across the sand. The wind is a river of air, moving endlessly across the globe. It has immense, invisible power. Perhaps the realization happened on the long, gentle curves of the Nile River in ancient Egypt, over 5,000 years ago. Imagine a weary fisherman standing in his small wooden boat. The sun is sinking lower, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. His arms ache from hours of rowing. He sets his heavy wooden paddle down inside the boat to rest. He stands up, and to dry his sweat, he holds up a wide woven mat of river reeds, stretching it out between his arms. Suddenly, a strong gust of evening wind blows off the desert. It hits the woven mat. The fisherman feels a sudden, powerful pull in his hands. He does not fall backward. Instead, the boat beneath his feet gently lurches forward. The water at the front of the boat parts with a soft, surprising splash. He is moving. He is not rowing, he is not pushing, but the boat is gliding smoothly over the dark water. The wind is doing the heavy work of 10 men. It was a quiet, magical revelation. Soon, the simple held mats were replaced by tall, sturdy wooden poles, the first masts planted deep into the center of the boats. And upon these masts, humans hung the first true sails. They were woven from thick linen or sewn together from heavy animal skins. Listen to the sensory poetry of a sailboat catching the wind for the very first time. There is the loud, sudden crack as the heavy fabric fills with air, snapping tight against the wooden ropes. The flat cloth swells into a deep, beautiful curve, like the belly of a breathing animal. The tall wooden mast creaks softly, bending just slightly under the invisible weight of the sky. And then, the beautiful, rhythmic sound of the water. As the boat accelerates, the bow slices through the waves. Swish, glide, splash. It is a hypnotic, soothing sound. There is no more desperate splashing of oars. There is no more heavy, labored breathing from tired men. There is only the clean smell of salt, the cool touch of the wind, and the silent, steady forward motion. The sailboat changed the scale of the human world. With the wind in our sails, the oceans were no longer terrifying walls holding us back. They became wide, blue highways of smooth glass. Ships grew larger. They were no longer hollowed-out logs. They were massive floating fortresses made of fragrant cedar wood, held together by thick ropes and copper nails. A single merchant ship, driven only by the free breath of the wind, could carry hundreds of tons of grain, jars of golden olive oil, and precious, sweet-smelling spices across the Mediterranean Sea in a matter of weeks. Cultures that had never met, separated by vast bodies of water, were suddenly connected. The sharing of stories, of food, and of ancient wisdom accelerated on the gentle ocean breezes. In other parts of the world, like the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, brave navigators built long, elegant canoes with beautiful woven sails. They read the patterns of the waves, the flights of the seabirds, and the colors of the clouds to sail thousands of miles across open water, finding tiny green islands resting alone in the middle of the deep blue nowhere. We had learned to ride the breath of the world, but sailing brought a new, profound danger. As the ships grew stronger and the captains grew bolder, we began to sail further away from the safety of the land. We left the familiar coastline behind. Imagine standing on the deck of a wooden ship, completely surrounded by water. You look to the north, the south, the east, and the west, and all you can see is a perfect, unbroken circle where the blue sky meets the blue sea. There are no mountains to guide you. There are no roads, no trees, no paths drawn in the dust. During the day, the bright sun could point the way. At night, if the sky was clear, the cold, distant stars offered a map of light. But the ocean is wildly unpredictable. What happens when a thick, heavy fog rolls in, swallowing the ship in a quiet, grey blindness? What happens when a massive storm covers the sky in thick black clouds for days on end, hiding the sun and the stars? In the middle of the open ocean, without a point of reference, a ship will simply sail in circles. The wind could push you hundreds of miles in the wrong direction, and you would never even know. The deep, terrifying fear of being truly, hopelessly lost in the dark began to haunt every sailor who dared to leave the shore. We needed something more reliable than the changing sky. We needed a guide that could see through the thickest fog and pierce the darkest storm. We needed to listen to a very quiet, invisible whisper coming from deep within the earth itself. We needed something more reliable than the changing sky. We needed a guide that could see through the thickest fog and pierce the darkest storm. We needed to listen to a very quiet, invisible whisper coming from deep within the earth itself. To understand the profound terror of being lost at sea, you must strip away everything you know about the modern world. Today, we carry glowing screens in our pockets that can pinpoint our exact location on the globe in a fraction of a second. But for thousands of years, the ocean was a realm of profound uncertainty. Imagine standing on the creaking wooden deck of an ancient merchant ship. The air is thick with the smell of salt and wet canvas. For days, the sky has been nothing but a heavy, unbroken ceiling of grey clouds. The wind, usually a helpful friend, has become a confusing enemy, shifting directions wildly. The familiar coastline vanished over the horizon a week ago. You look out over the railing, and there is nothing but the endless, churning expanse of dark water. No landmarks, no roads, no signs. In this vast, featureless world, how do you know which way is home? How do you know if the strong wind pushing your sails is carrying you toward a safe harbor, or driving you further out into the deep, endless unknown? The early sailors were masters of observation. They read the subtle changes in the color of the water, the types of seaweed floating on the surface, and the flight paths of seabirds returning to their nests at dusk. On clear nights, they tilted their heads upward, reading the cold, glittering map of the stars. But these methods were fragile. A sudden storm or a heavy fog could blind them completely. They were entirely at the mercy of the weather. The answer to this ancient fear was not found by looking up at the sky. Surprisingly, the solution was waiting quietly in the dirt. Let us travel far to the east, to ancient China, more than 2,000 years ago. In the quiet, mountainous regions, miners searching for copper and iron occasionally uncovered a very strange type of rock. It was dark, heavy, and unremarkable to look at, but it possessed a silent, invisible magic. This stone, known as lodestone, is a naturally magnetized piece of the mineral magnetite. If you placed a small piece of iron near it, the iron would suddenly leap across the gap, clinging tightly to the dark rock. It was as if the stone had an invisible reaching hand. At first, this phenomenon was viewed as a curiosity, a trick of the earth used by fortune tellers and mystics. They would carve the lodestone into the shape of a smooth spoon and place it on a polished bronze plate. When they spun the spoon, it would eventually come to a slow, trembling stop. And every single time, without fail, the handle of the spoon pointed in the exact same direction, south. It was a mesmerizing parlor trick. But it took centuries for human ingenuity to realize that this quiet, trembling spoon could be the key to conquering the oceans. The turning point came when scholars discovered a vital secret about this strange magnetic force. You did not have to carry a heavy chunk of lodestone with you to find your way. The magic could be transferred. Imagine the delicate, focused work of an ancient craftsman. He takes a thin, sharp needle of iron. He picks up a piece of lodestone and rubs it carefully along the length of the needle, always in the same direction. Stroke, lift, stroke, lift. With each pass, the invisible force of the earth is passed from the rock into the metal. The iron needle awakens. Now, imagine the craftsman taking a small bowl of still water. He carefully places a tiny piece of wood, or perhaps a dry reed, on the surface so that it floats. Then, very gently, he rests the magnetized iron needle on top of the wood. Watch the needle closely. For a moment, it drifts aimlessly on the tiny ripples. But then, an invisible hand seems to grasp it. The needle begins to turn. Slowly, deliberately, it swings around. And then, it stops. It points perfectly, silently, toward the magnetic poles of the earth. This was the very first compass. It was a masterpiece of simplicity. A bowl of water, a splinter of wood, and a touch needle. The introduction of the compass to the seafaring world changed everything. It was a quiet revolution that completely removed the terror of the fog. Picture a ship caught in a blinding storm. The rain is lashing against the wooden deck. The captain cannot see the sun, the moon, or the stars. The wind is howling, throwing the ship violently from side to side. In the past, this meant certain disaster. They would simply drift, hopelessly lost in the grey void. But now, the captain steps into the small, dim cabin. He lights a single flickering lantern. He looks down at a wooden box, secured tightly to the table. Inside, resting on a small pivot, is a magnetized needle, dancing slightly with the motion of the waves. Despite the chaos outside, despite the spinning of the ship, the needle remains stubbornly fixed. It points north. It is a silent, unwavering promise. With that tiny piece of iron, the captain knows exactly where he's heading. He grips the heavy wooden wheel, turns the ship, and cuts through the storm with absolute confidence. The compass shrank the oceans. It allowed navigators to draw accurate, reliable maps of the world for the first time. They could sail in straight lines across vast distances, day or night, rain or shine. The great voyages of discovery, the ships that finally connected the continents, creating a truly global web of trade and communication, were entirely guided by the silent whisper of the lodestone. We had conquered the earth, we had tamed the fire, we had learned to ride the wind, and we had finally found our way across the pathless sea. With our bellies full from the plow, and our ships safely guided by the compass, our minds turned back toward the shore. We had built massive, bustling cities filled with merchants, scholars, and kings. We had thousands of stories to tell, and mountains of knowledge to share. But the heavy clay tablets we used to record our thoughts were clumsy. They were slow to make, difficult to store, and nearly impossible to carry on a long journey. We needed a new canvas, a surface that was light as a feather, smooth as glass, and capable of holding the weight of human history. Capable of holding the weight of human history. For thousands of years, the simple act of writing was a heavy physical burden. We had learned to carve our laws into towering pillars of black stone, ensuring they would stand for centuries. We had learned to press our debts and promises into thick, damp cushions of river mud, baking them in the hot sun until they turned to heavy clay. But as human knowledge grew, these materials became a quiet trap. Imagine an ancient scholar trying to build a library. Every single book is a massive, dusty pile of clay tablets. To read an epic poem, you had to lift heavy stones one by one. If you dropped one, a piece of the story shattered into 100 pieces on the floor. In other parts of the world, people tried to find lighter paths. In ancient Egypt, they sliced the green, triangular stems of the papyrus plant, laying the wet strips across each other and pounding them flat. It was lighter than clay, yes, but it was brittle. If you folded a piece of papyrus, it would simply snap and break. In Europe, they turned to the herds of animals, stretching the skins of sheep and calves tightly over wooden frames, scraping them clean to create parchment. Parchment was incredibly smooth and durable, but it was a luxury of kings. To create just one large book of parchment required the skins of hundreds of animals. It was so precious that monks would often scrape the ink off ancient, beautiful books just so they could reuse the blank pages. We had so many stories to tell. We had so many stars to map, and so many medicines to record. But the canvas was either too heavy to carry, too fragile to fold, or too expensive to own. The answer to this quiet crisis did not come from stone or skin or expensive leaves. The answer was born from destruction. It was born from the discarded, the broken, and the old. Let us travel across the vast rolling mountains to the imperial courts of the Han Dynasty in ancient China, roughly 2,000 years ago. Here, the scholars wrote their grand histories on long, narrow strips of bamboo, tying them together with silk threads. A single book could weigh as much as a small child. When a famous scholar traveled, he needed entire wooden carts just to carry his reading material. A court official named Kai Lun watched this slow, heavy procession of knowledge. He watched the scholars struggling under the weight of their own wisdom, and he began to wonder if there was a different way. Kai Lun did not invent a completely new material. Instead, he performed a kind of quiet, wet alchemy. Imagine standing in a shaded courtyard in ancient China. The air is humid, smelling of wet earth and crushed plants. In the center of the yard is a massive stone vat filled with murky river water. Into this water, the workers throw the things the world no longer wants: old, torn fishing nets, the frayed, useless ends of hemp props, scraps of worn-out fabric, and the tough, fibrous inner bark of the mulberry tree. Then, the heavy work begins. Listen to the rhythmic, echoing sound of heavy wooden mallets striking the wet mass. Thump, 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 for hours. They beat the old materials, crushing them, tearing them apart, breaking them down into their smallest, most invisible threads. The solid nets and bark dissolve, turning the clear water into a thick, cloudy white soup of suspended fibers. Now, the true magic happens. A craftsman steps forward, holding a rectangular wooden frame. Stretched tightly across the bottom of the frame is a very fine, delicate screen made of thin bamboo threads. He dips the wooden frame deep into the cloudy water. He moves it gently beneath the surface, letting the suspended fibers swirl over the screen. And then, with perfectly practiced, steady hands, he lifts the frame straight up into the air. Listen to the soft, chaotic sound of the water falling away. It drips rapidly through the tiny holes in the bamboo screen, splashing back into the stone vat. But the fibers do not fall. As the water drains, the millions of tiny crushed threads of hemp and bark are left behind on the screen. They settle over each other, tangling together, interlocking in a tight, wet, chaotic web. The craftsman carefully flips the screen, pressing the wet, fragile layer onto a smooth, flat board. He places the board against a warm brick wall, heated gently by a fire on the other side. As the gentle heat of the wall bakes the moisture out of the fibers, they shrink and bind together with incredible strength. The craftsman waits patiently, and then he reaches out, taking hold of the top corner. Listen to the incredibly satisfying crisp crackle as he slowly peels the sheet away from the wall. It is impossibly light. It is flexible. You can bend it, fold it, and roll it, and it will not break. It is beautifully, perfectly blank, a bright, smooth, empty space, just waiting for the dark touch of ink. This was the very first sheet of true paper. The invention of paper was a quiet explosion that echoed across the entire globe. Suddenly, the weight of human knowledge was lifted. A merchant could fold a letter recording a massive trade and tuck it safely into a small pocket near his heart. An artist could capture the sweeping, misty beauty of a mountain range with a few elegant strokes of a brush. But most importantly, paper completely changed the shape of the book. Because paper was so thin and so incredibly flexible, you no longer had to roll it into a long, clumsy scroll. You could cut it into perfect, uniform rectangles. You could stack hundreds of these rectangles on top of one another and sew them together along one edge. The Codex, the modern book, was born. Imagine the feeling of holding one of these early books, the quiet rustle of turning a page. A scholar could hold an entire library of ancient thought in a single leather saddlebag. Knowledge began to flow along the Silk Road, crossing deserts and mountains, traveling faster and further than ever before. Paper provided the perfect, inexpensive canvas for the human mind. The world was suddenly filled with blank pages, waiting to be filled. But as the stacks of crisp, empty paper grew higher and higher in the workshops of the world, a new, frustrating bottleneck appeared. The canvas was ready, but the brush was simply too slow. Writing a book by hand is a beautiful, meditative art, but it is agonizingly slow. A devoted monk, sitting in a freezing, candlelit room, might spend a year of his life perfectly copying just one single volume. If he made a mistake, he had to carefully scrape the ink away and start the page again. Because books took so long to write, they remained incredibly rare, locked away in quiet monasteries or the private libraries of kings. We had the paper, we had the stories, but we needed a way to multiply our words. We needed a way to press our thoughts into the page, not one beautiful letter at a time, but thousands of them, all at once. But thousands of them, all at once. For centuries, the quiet, freezing rooms of isolated monasteries were the only factories of knowledge in the Western world. Imagine a devoted monk sitting at a slanted wooden desk in the pale light of winter. He pulls his heavy wool robe tight against the chill. His fingers are stiff. He dips the tip of a sharpened goose feather into a small clay pot of dark ink. He leans forward and very carefully, very slowly, he draws a single elegant letter onto a blank page. Then another and another. He cannot rush. He cannot let his mind wander. If he makes a single tiny mistake, if a heavy drop of ink falls from the feather and stains the page, the entire sheet is ruined. He must carefully scrape the dried ink away with a knife, or throw the expensive page into the fire and begin all over again. A monk might spend an entire year of his life working from the first light of dawn until the last rays of the sun disappeared, just to copy one single book. Because they took so long to create, books were incredibly rare. They were precious treasures, often bound in heavy leather and locked away in the private libraries of kings, or literally chained to the heavy wooden shelves of universities so they could not be taken. The vast, overwhelming majority of humanity lived their entire lives without ever holding a book, and without ever reading a single word. Knowledge was a quiet river, trapped behind a massive dam of time and labor. Far away in the east, brilliant craftsmen had found a clever way to speed up this slow, agonizing process. They would take a smooth, flat block of wood and carefully carve an entire page of text into the surface. They brushed wet ink over the raised wooden letters and gently pressed a sheet of paper against it. It was a beautiful, meditative art. But it was rigid. Carving a single wooden block took weeks of perfectly steady handiwork. And once that block was finished, it could only ever print at one specific page. If you made a mistake in the carving, you had to throw the whole block away. And if you wanted to print a completely different book, you had to carve thousands of new blocks all over again. The true revolution required someone to look at the rigid, solid words and break them apart. Let us step into a dusty, dimly lit workshop in the city of Mainz, Germany, in the middle of the 15th century. The air inside this room does not smell like the quiet, sweet incense of a monastery. It smells of heavy industry. It smells of hot metal, sawdust, and something entirely new. A thick, rich, earthy scent of boiled linseed oil and dark black soot. Here, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg had spent years wrestling with a magnificent puzzle. He realized that a book was not just a collection of pages. A page was not just a collection of words. Every word in the world was simply a different combination of just a few dozen little shapes. The letters of the alphabet. If you could make those letters perfectly uniform, and if you could move them around, you could print anything. Imagine the meticulous, quiet work of creating the very first metal type. A craftsman carves a single perfect letter, let us say the letter A, into the end of a hard steel punch. He strikes the steel punch into a softer piece of copper, leaving a perfect, indented impression of the letter. This is the matrix, the mold. He takes this copper mold and locks it into a small handheld cast. And then he pours a glowing, molten mixture of lead, tin, and antimony into the mold. The metal cools almost instantly. He opens the cast, and out falls a tiny, perfect, solid metal A. He does this again and again, hundreds of times, thousands of times. Soon, the workshop is filled with shallow wooden cases, divided into dozens of tiny square compartments. Each compartment holds hundreds of identical metal letters. Now listen to the hypnotic, rhythmic sounds of the printing process. A worker, known as the compositor, stands in front of the wooden cases. He holds a small metal tray in his left hand. His right hand darts over the boxes, picking up the tiny metal letters one by one. Click, click, click. He places them into the tray, spelling out the words line by line. But he must do something incredibly difficult. He must assemble the words completely backward, reading from right to left, so that when they are pressed onto the paper, they will appear perfectly forward. When a full page of text is locked tightly into a heavy metal frame, it is carried over to the machine that will change the world, the printing press. Gutenberg did not invent the press itself from nothing. He looked at the heavy wooden machines used by farmers to crush olives into oil and grapes into wine, and he adapted their slow, powerful squeeze. Imagine the massive, heavy wooden beams of the press reaching up to the ceiling. The frame of letters is laid flat on the bed of the press. Another worker takes two large, soft leather balls, stuffed tightly with sheep's wool. He dips the leather balls into the thick, dark, sticky ink. Listen to the wet, rhythmic squelch as he vigorously beats the leather balls against the metal type, covering every single letter in a perfect, even layer of wet black oil. He carefully lays a sheet of soft, slightly damp paper over the inked letters. He pushes the wooden bed under the massive center screw of the press. And then he reaches up and grabs the heavy wooden handle. He pulls it toward himself with all his strength. Listen to the deep, resonant groan of the ancient timber. The heavy wooden block descends. It presses down onto the paper with immense, perfectly even pressure, forcing the soft paper fibers to drink the dark ink from the metal letters. He releases the handle. The wood creaks as the pressure lifts. He pulls the wooden bed back out into the light. And then, the moment of magic. He gently takes the corner of the damp paper and pulls it slowly upward. Shuck! The paper comes away clean. And there, resting perfectly on the crisp white surface, are hundreds of sharp, beautiful, identical black letters. A perfect page of text. But the true miracle was not this single page. The true miracle was what happened next. The worker slid a new, blank piece of paper over the metal letters. He pulled the heavy wooden handle again. Creak. Thud. Another perfect page. And another. And another. In a single day, this rhythmic, creaking wooden machine could produce more pages than a devoted monk could write in an entire lifetime. The dam had finally broken. The quiet river of knowledge suddenly became a roaring ocean. Books were no longer the locked-away treasures of kings. They became smaller, cheaper, and lighter. They flooded into the hands of ordinary people, crossing borders and climbing mountains. A farmer could learn the secrets of the stars. A merchant could read the philosophies of ancient Greece. Ideas spread like tiny, invisible seeds caught in a strong wind, taking root in minds all over the earth. Humanity was waking up. We were reading, learning, and dreaming at a pace we had never experienced before. But as the millions of new books spread across the world, a quiet, physical problem began to reveal itself. We had created the perfect canvas, and we had found a way to multiply our words endlessly. People were sitting by their fireplaces late into the night, their eyes scanning the beautiful, crisp black letters. But the human body is fragile. As we grow older, the lenses inside our eyes begin to harden. They lose their flexibility, and slowly, quietly, the small black letters on the white paper begin to lose their sharp edges. They become soft. They blur into illegible grey smudges. Imagine the deep, quiet heartbreak of an old scholar, holding a brand new, beautifully printed book in his hands, but finding that his own eyes can no longer read the words. We had mastered the earth, the fire, and the wind. Now, to save our fading sight, we needed to learn how to master the light itself. Now, to save our fading sight, we needed to learn how to master the light itself. Imagine the deep, quiet frustration of an aging master craftsman or a devoted scholar living 500 years ago. The printing press had just filled the world with crisp, beautiful, inexpensive books. The air was buzzing with new ideas, new maps, and new stories. The world was finally waking up. But for many, this great awakening arrived just a little too late. The human eye is a soft, miraculous, and fragile thing. Inside, it rests a tiny, clear lens that bends and flexes thousands of times a day, focusing the light from the world around us. But as the decades pass, as our hair turns silver and our steps grow a little slower, that tiny lens begins to tire. It hardens. It loses its youthful flexibility. Slowly, without making a sound, a quiet thief steals away the sharp edges of the world. Picture an old man sitting by a window in the late afternoon. The golden sunlight is pouring in, falling across the open pages of a brand new, perfectly printed book. He loves to read. He has spent his whole life reading. But now, as he looks down at the page, the crisp black letters refuse to stand still. They blur together into soft, fuzzy grey shapes. He blinks, trying to force his eyes to focus. He holds the book close to his face, and then pushes it far away at the end of his arm, leaning his head back. But it is no use. The knowledge is right there in his hands, but an invisible wall has been placed between him and the words. In the ancient world, this fading of the sight was simply accepted as the natural heavy cost of growing old. When a tailor could no longer thread his tiny needle, or a monk could no longer read his prayers, they simply had to stop working. Decades of wisdom and skill were quietly locked away, long before the mind was ready to rest. But human curiosity does not accept the word impossible. We looked at the natural world, and we noticed a gentle, watery secret. If you walk through a quiet garden just after a morning rain, and you look closely at a single, perfectly round drop of water resting on a green leaf, something magical happens. The water bends the sunlight. If you look through the drop, the tiny, intricate veins of the leaf beneath it suddenly appear massive. The water acts like an invisible, magnifying eye. For a long time, scholars tried to use this secret to read. They would take clear, heavy stones, like quartz or beryl, and polish them into smooth, half-round domes. They called them reading stones. An old monk would place this heavy, cold stone flat onto the parchment and slide it slowly across the page. As the stone moved, the tiny letters beneath it would suddenly swell and rise up, sharp and clear. It was a beautiful solution, but it was clumsy. You had to hold the heavy stone with one hand, which made it very difficult to write, or to work with tools. We needed something completely weightless. We needed to freeze that perfect drop of morning water and wear it on our faces. To do this, we had to tame one of the most mysterious and dangerous materials on Earth, glass. Let us travel to the quiet, watery islands of Murano, near the great city of Venice in Italy. Here, away from the wooden houses of the main city, massive brick furnaces burned day and night. The heat was immense, shimmering in the air like a physical wall. Inside those roaring ovens, simple white sand, mixed with ash from the sea, was heated until it melted into a glowing, thick, bright orange syrup. The glassmakers were masters of fire and breath. They would dip a long, hollow iron pipe into the molten syrup, gathering a glowing ball of liquid fire at the end. Then they would blow gently into the pipe. The heavy, glowing liquid would expand like a fragile, fiery balloon. For centuries, glass was beautiful, but it was cloudy. It was filled with tiny bubbles and dark impurities. You could not look through it clearly. But the glassmakers of Venice were patient. They experimented, refining their sand, purifying their ash, until one day, the liquid cooled into something miraculous. It was completely, perfectly clear. It looked exactly like solid air. They called it cristallo. Now that we had clear glass, the delicate, rhythmic work of the lens grinder could begin. Imagine a craftsman sitting at a sturdy wooden table. In front of him is a spinning wheel, coated in fine, wet sand. He takes a small, thick piece of clear glass and presses it gently against the spinning wheel. Listen to the soothing, rhythmic sound of the grinding. Shh, shh, shh. It is a slow, patient friction. Water drips steadily onto the wheel to keep the glass from shattering. The craftsman grinds the glass so that it is slightly thicker in the middle and thinner at the edges. He is carefully copying the natural, perfect curve of the human eye. When he is finished, he wipes the wet sand away. The glass is smooth and cold. He places 2 of these small, perfectly carved circles of glass into frames made of polished wood or lightweight animal bone. He connects the 2 frames with a small brass rivet in the center. These were the very first spectacles. Imagine the profound, overwhelming emotion of the old scholar trying them on for the first time. He carefully rests the wooden frames on the bridge of his nose. He looks down at the printed book on his desk. In a single fraction of a second, the blurry grey world snaps violently back into perfect, razor-sharp focus. The letters are dark, clear, and beautiful once again. The invisible wall has vanished. The relief is so deep, so sudden, that tears well up in his eyes. He is not old and useless anymore. He has been given his life back. The invention of glass lenses was a quiet miracle that instantly doubled the active working life of humanity. Master painters could continue to paint their tiny, perfect details deep into their old age. Philosophers could read for decades longer. The aging mind was no longer trapped by the failing body. But humanity never stops at simply fixing a problem. Once we learned how to bend the light to heal our broken eyes, we began to wonder what else the light could show us. What if we took 2 of these perfectly ground glass lenses and placed them at opposite ends of a long, dark tube? When we pointed that tube down toward the earth, the invisible world suddenly opened up to us. We looked at a single drop of pond water, and the microscope revealed a chaotic, bustling universe of tiny swimming creatures we never even knew existed. We realized we were not alone. The world was teeming with invisible life. And when a curious Italian named Galileo pointed that same glass tube up into the quiet, black night sky, the universe shattered our expectations. The stars were no longer just tiny pinpricks of light painted on a ceiling. The moon was not a smooth, perfect pearl. Through the glass, it suddenly leaped closer, revealing deep, jagged craters and massive, silent grey mountains. We saw the rings of Saturn. We saw tiny moons dancing around Jupiter. The glass lenses proved that the Earth was just a tiny, spinning rock floating in an impossibly vast, deeply silent ocean of space. As we stared up at the heavens through our glass eyes, we watched the perfect, endless, rhythmic turning of the stars and the planets. They moved with absolute silent precision. The universe was a massive, sweeping dance. And as we sat in our growing cities, trying to organize our busy lives, our farms, and our meetings, We realized we needed a way to bring that perfect heavenly rhythm down to earth. We needed a way to trap the invisible flow of the day and break it into tiny, perfectly equal pieces. We needed a way to trap the invisible flow of the day and break it into tiny, perfectly equal pieces. For the vast majority of our history on this earth, time was a very soft, stretching thing. It was not made of sharp edges or exact numbers. It was made of shadows and light. Imagine how an ancient farmer experienced the passing of a day. There was the cool, blue quiet of the morning. There was the harsh, heavy heat of the high noon, when the sun stood directly overhead and the shadows disappeared beneath his feet. And there was the golden, dusty fading of the evening, when the birds returned to the trees and the air grew cool once again. Time was a gentle, breathing rhythm. It belonged completely to nature. If we wanted to measure it, we used the earth itself. We carved large, flat stones into sundials, placing a single, sharp piece of metal in the center. As the sun traveled silently across the vast blue sky, the metal would cast a dark, sharp shadow onto the stone. Imagine watching that shadow. It moves so slowly that the human eye cannot even perceive the motion. It just creeps silently, millimeter by millimeter, sliding across the carved lines. But the sundial had a fatal flaw. It was completely helpless against the sky. When a thick, grey blanket of clouds rolled in, hiding the sun, time simply vanished. The shadow disappeared, and when the evening came and the sun dipped below the horizon, the sundial went to sleep. The entire night was a vast, unmeasured ocean of darkness. We tried to find other ways to capture the hours. We tried to trap time in water. In ancient Egypt and Greece, they built water clocks called clepsydras. Imagine a quiet, cool room at midnight. In the corner, a large clay bowl filled with water is resting on a tall stand. At the very bottom of the bowl is a tiny, perfect hole. Listen to the sound. Drip, drip, drip. The water falls steadily into a second bowl, resting on the floor below. Inside the bottom bowl, there are lines carved into the clay. As the water slowly rises, line by line, it marks the passing of the hours. It was a beautiful, soothing invention. But water is wild, and it refuses to be perfectly tamed. When the top bowl was full, the heavy weight of the water pushed the drops out very fast. But as the bowl emptied, the water pressure dropped, and the dripping grew slower and slower. And if you lived far to the north, in the freezing, bitter grip of winter, the water clock would simply turn to solid ice, and time would stop completely. We needed a way to measure the darkness that did not rely on the weather. We needed a machine that would never freeze, never sleep, and never slow down. The answer to this quiet crisis was not born in a busy marketplace or in the court of a wealthy king. It was born in the freezing, absolute silence of medieval European monasteries. Imagine the heavy stone walls of an abbey in the mountains of Italy or France, nearly 1,000 years ago. The monks who lived there had dedicated their entire lives to a rigid, unbreakable schedule of prayer. They had to pray 7 times a day, and most importantly, they had to wake up in the absolute dead of night to sing in the dark chapel. But how do you know when it is exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, when the sky is black, the moon is hidden by a snowstorm, and the water clock has frozen solid? How do you know when to ring the heavy bronze bell to wake the sleeping brothers? Some devoted monks would try to stay awake, burning a long candle with marks carved into the wax, watching it melt hour by agonizing hour. But human eyes grow heavy. The mind drifts into dreams. They needed a tireless servant, a servant made of iron and gravity. In the dusty, glowing heat of the blacksmith's forge, a quiet mechanical revolution began. It started with a simple, heavy lead weight, tied to the end of a long, thick rope. If you wrap that rope around a wooden barrel and let the weight drop, it simply falls to the floor in a few seconds, spinning the barrel wildly. Gravity is a powerful, instant force. The genius of the mechanical clock was learning how to tame gravity, how to catch it and release it in perfect, tiny steps. This magic was called the escapement. Imagine the beautiful, complex inside of the very first mechanical clocks. There is a large wheel made of hand-forged iron, with sharp, jagged teeth cut all the way around its edge. The heavy lead weight is pulling on the rope, desperately trying to spin the wheel and fall to the ground. But resting just above the toothed wheel is a delicate piece of metal, rocking slowly back and forth. As the heavy wheel tries to turn, the rocking metal drops down and catches one of the teeth. It stops the wheel completely. Tick. Then, as the metal rocks back the other way, it releases the tooth, allowing the wheel to slip forward just a tiny fraction of an inch before catching the next tooth. Tock. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. Listen to that sound. It is a slow, heavy, metallic heartbeat. It is the sound of human ingenuity chopping the invisible flow of time into perfectly equal, perfectly mathematical pieces. The heavy lead weight still falls to the floor, but instead of falling in 3 seconds, the escapement forces it to fall over the course of 24 hours. When these early clocks were built, they did not have faces or hands. They did not need them. They were simply blind machines, sitting high up in the dark stone towers of the monasteries, slowly ticking away the night. Connected to the spinning gears was a large wooden hammer. When the gears reached a certain point, the hammer would lift and drop against a massive bronze bell. Bong, bong, bong. The deep, resonating sound would roll out of the tower, floating over the sleeping village, echoing against the distant mountains. It was a completely new sound in the history of the world. It was the sound of exact mechanical certainty. Soon, the clocks moved out of the quiet monasteries and into the bustling centers of the growing cities. We added massive, beautiful faces to the towers, painting them with gold leaf and bright blue skies. We added a single, slow-moving hand to point to the hours. The mechanical clock fundamentally changed human psychology. Before the clock, we belonged to nature. We ate when our stomachs were empty, and we slept when the sky grew dark. But with the invention of the escapement, the rhythm of the world shifted. We stopped looking up at the sun, and we started looking up at the tower. The city became synchronized. The merchant knew exactly when to open his shop. The baker knew exactly how long to leave the bread in the oven. The workers knew exactly when to arrive at the docks. We built a beautiful, invisible grid of hours and minutes, and we laid it gently over the chaos of human life. It brought order. It brought a shared, comforting structure to the day. We had mastered the complex, beautiful dance of iron gears and falling weights. We had built machines of incredible precision. But as we stood in the city squares, looking up at the heavy, ticking iron in the towers, we began to dream of a different kind of power. The clock was brilliant, but it was weak. It was driven only by the slow, gentle pull of gravity. We looked at the heavy wagons stuck in the mud. We looked at the deep, flooded coal mines where men broke their backs carrying buckets of water. We realized that if we could build a machine to count the hours, Perhaps we could build a machine strong enough to lift the heaviest burdens off the shoulders of humanity. But gravity was not strong enough. Wind was too unpredictable. Water wheels could not be moved. We needed a new kind of muscle. We needed to harness the boiling breath of water and give the iron a pair of lungs. We needed to harness the boiling breath of water and give the iron a pair of lungs. For thousands of years, the absolute limit of human achievement was tied to the strength of living muscle. If we wanted to build a towering cathedral, plow a massive field, or move a heavy stone, we had to rely on the aching backs of men, or the broad, patient shoulders of horses and oxen. We had learned to catch the wind in our sails, and we had learned to let the river turn our wooden wheels. But the wind stops blowing, and the rivers sometimes run dry. As the centuries passed, and our quiet villages grew into massive, sprawling cities, the deep forests of Europe began to disappear. The trees were cut down to build ships, to build homes, and to feed the millions of hungry fireplaces, keeping the winter cold at bay. With the wood disappearing, humanity had to look downward, deep into the dark, damp earth, to find a different kind of fuel: coal. Black, heavy stones of ancient, compressed sunlight that burned hotter and longer than any wood. But the earth does not give up its treasures easily. Imagine the terrifying, exhausting life of an early coal miner, hundreds of years ago. You climb down a narrow wooden ladder into a pitch-black shaft, hundreds of feet below the bright, warm surface of the world. The air down there is thick and cold. It smells of wet rock and ancient dust. The only light comes from a tiny, fragile candle strapped to your head. But the darkness was not the greatest enemy. The true enemy was the water. The deep earth is completely soaked. Hidden underground rivers and silent springs constantly bleed into the dark tunnels. As the miners dug deeper, the black water would pool around their ankles, then their knees. If left alone, the entire mine would quietly flood, sealing the coal away forever. To fight the rising water, the miners used the only muscle they had. Imagine a continuous, agonizing line of men and horses, hauling heavy wooden buckets of water up a long, dark rope, hour after hour, day and night. It was an impossible, exhausting battle against the relentless weight of the ocean hidden below the ground. We had reached the very edge of what muscle could do. We needed a giant. The answer began with a simple, quiet observation in a warm kitchen. If you place a heavy iron kettle filled with water over a hot fire and you let it boil, something magical happens. The calm, liquid water gets angry. It transforms. It expands into a massive, invisible cloud of gas. If you put a heavy iron lid on the kettle, the invisible steam will push against it. It will rattle and lift the heavy iron, desperately trying to escape into the air. Water, when heated, has the power to push. In the early 1700s, an English ironmonger named Thomas Newcomen looked at the deep, flooded mines, and he looked at the boiling water, and he brought them together in a masterpiece of heavy, slow engineering. He built a massive engine house right above the dark mine shaft. Inside this towering brick building was a giant cylinder made of polished brass. Inside the cylinder was a heavy metal piston that could slide up and down. Listen to the slow, heavy rhythm of the very first steam engine. It is not fast. It is a slow, mechanical giant taking a very deep breath. Deep below the cylinder, a massive coal fire roars, boiling a huge boiler of water. The worker opens a valve. Hiss. As the hot, expanding steam rushes up into the brass cylinder, pushing the heavy piston all the way to the top. The giant takes a breath in. But the steam cannot pull the water out of the mine by itself. The true magic happens in the next fraction of a second. When the cylinder is full of hot steam, a tiny jet of freezing cold water is sprayed inside. Instantly, the hot steam collapses. It shrinks back into a few tiny drops of liquid water. Where there was once a massive cloud of gas, there is suddenly nothing. An absolute void, a vacuum. And nature absolutely hates a vacuum. With nothing inside the cylinder to push back, the heavy, invisible weight of the Earth's atmosphere crashes down on top of the piston. Thud. The massive iron piston is slammed downward with the force of dozens of horses. As it crashes down, it pulls on a massive wooden beam, which reaches deep into the black mine and violently yanks a massive pump, lifting hundreds of gallons of dark water out of the earth in a single motion. Then the valve opens again. Hiss! The steam enters. The piston rises. Spray. The vacuum forms. Tud. The water is lifted. Imagine standing near this massive, hissing, clanking giant in the dead of night. The ground shakes with every heavy beat. Hiss. Thud. Hiss. Thud. It is a slow, powerful lullaby of iron and fire. The steam engine never tired. It never needed to sleep. It stood in the dark, breathing in the steam and breathing out the water, saving the mines from the deep floods. But humanity is restless. A brilliant Scottish engineer named James Watt looked at this hissing giant and realized it was wasting its breath. He refined the engine, making it smoother, smaller, and incredibly efficient. And most importantly, he taught the giant how to turn a wheel. Once the steam engine could turn a heavy iron wheel continuously, the world fundamentally changed. The engine moved out of the dark, lonely coal mines and into the bright, bustling cities. We connected the iron lungs to massive looms, spinning thousands of threads of cotton at once, weaving soft fabrics at an impossible speed. The rhythm of human labor shifted from the quiet spinning wheel in the living room to the loud, rhythmic chugging of the massive factories. And then we had the most beautiful, audacious idea of all. We took the roaring fire, the boiling water, and the heavy iron wheels, and we put them on the road. We built the steam locomotive. Imagine standing on a quiet, grassy hill at twilight, looking down at a long valley. The world is perfectly still. And then, from far away, you hear a sound that your ancestors could never have imagined. A deep, mournful, hollow whistle cutting through the cool evening air. You see a thick plume of white smoke rising into the purple sky. And then, the heavy, rhythmic heartbeat of the train. Chug, 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 chug. The massive metal wheels roll over the long iron tracks. The ground beneath your feet trembles slightly as the heavy beast rushes past, pulling dozens of wooden cars behind it. The steam engine shrank the massive continents. A journey that used to take 3 exhausting, dangerous months of walking through mud and snow could now be completed in a few comfortable, rhythmic days, sitting by a glass window and watching the world blur past. We were conquering the vast distances of the earth. We laid thousands of miles of iron tracks, tying the distant cities together with ribbons of steel. We could send our heavy goods, our families, and our written letters across the country faster than ever before. But as we watched the trains roar into the distance, carrying our paper letters in their dark cargo cars, a new frustration began to grow. The heavy iron beast was fast, but it was not fast enough for the human mind. If a terrible storm was coming, or if a child was born in a distant city, The news still had to physically travel on the train. The paper had to make the journey. It took days, sometimes weeks. We watched the sudden, violent, silent flash of a lightning bolt illuminating a dark summer sky. It moved instantly from the clouds to the earth in a fraction of a heartbeat. And we began to wonder, what if we could separate our words from the heavy paper? What if we could capture that invisible lightning and teach it how to speak? What if we could separate our words from the heavy paper? What if we could capture that invisible lightning and teach it how to speak? For the entirety of human history up to this point, a message was a physical thing. It had weight. It had a body. If you wanted to tell someone, "I love you," or "the war is over," or "I am coming home," those words had to be written down on a piece of paper, folded carefully, and carried by a living creature or a heavy machine. Even with the magnificent, roaring steam trains rushing across the iron tracks, a letter was chained to the physical world. It could only travel as fast as the spinning wheels of the locomotive. Imagine the deep, heavy anxiety of waiting. A mother sitting by a window in a quiet farmhouse, watching the dusty road for the mail carrier. Her son has moved across the vast rolling plains to a city thousands of miles away. She sent him a letter a month ago. She waits and waits, not knowing if he is safe or sick, or if he even received her words. The silence between distant cities was an ocean, a heavy, unbreakable barrier of time. But as the steam engines conquered the earth, quiet scholars in dusty laboratories were playing with a completely different kind of power. A power that had no weight. A power that could not be seen, but could be felt. Electricity. For a long time, electricity was just a terrifying mystery of the sky. It was the jagged, blinding flash of a thunderstorm. But we learned to catch it. We learned to trap tiny, safe sparks in glass jars and metal wires. And as we watched those sparks leap from one end of a copper wire to the other in a fraction of a heartbeat, a profound, world-changing realization washed over us. This invisible energy did not care about physical distance. It moved at the speed of light. But electricity is not a human voice. It cannot speak our language. It cannot carry a piece of paper. It is simply a burst of energy, a silent, sudden shock. To use this magic, we had to invent a completely new way of talking. We had to turn human thought into rhythm. Let us picture a small, quiet room in the middle of the 19th century. A man sits at a simple wooden desk. In front of him is a strange, beautiful little machine made of polished brass and mahogany wood. It is the telegraph key. It looks like a small metal lever resting on a spring. Connected to this brass key is a thin, solid copper wire. This wire runs out the window, climbs up a tall wooden pole, and stretches out across the fields, across the rivers, and through the deep forests, traveling hundreds of miles to another quiet room in another distant city. The man at the desk rests his fingers gently on the round, smooth knob of the brass lever. He takes a breath, and he presses down. Listen to the crisp, sharp sound. Click. When he presses the lever down, the invisible circuit is completed. A silent, unseen wave of electric energy rushes through the long copper wire, traveling hundreds of miles in the blink of an eye. And at the exact same moment, in that distant room far away, a small metal hammer is pulled downward by a magnet. Clack. If he holds the lever down for just a fraction of a second, it is a short pulse, a dot. If he holds it down just a little bit longer, it is a long pulse, a dash. This was the beautiful, rhythmic language invented by Samuel Morse, the Morse code. It was a language of pure sound and time. Click, clack, click, click, clack, clack. Imagine the profound, staggering magic of that very first long-distance message. In the year 1844, Samuel Morse sat in a chamber in Washington, D.C., and tapped out a simple, famous question. What hath God wrought? Instantly, perfectly. The heavy silence in a room in Baltimore, 40 miles away, was broken by the mechanical tapping of the receiver. The heavy, physical chains of distance were suddenly shattered. The world changed overnight. Suddenly, tall wooden poles began to march across the continents like a quiet, still army. They carried millions of miles of thin copper wire, suspended high in the air, humming gently in the wind. We called it the Victorian Internet. A newspaper in New York could report on a grand event happening in London on the exact same day. A doctor could send life-saving advice to a distant hospital in seconds. The painful, agonizing months of waiting for a letter simply vanished. We had learned to whisper into the ear of the entire world. But the continents were still separated by the massive, deep, and silent oceans. The telegraph poles could not stand on water. And so, humanity attempted one of the most audacious, poetic engineering feats in history: the transatlantic cable. Imagine a massive, heavy iron ship sailing slowly into the freezing grey waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Deep in its belly, it carries thousands of miles of incredibly heavy copper cable, wrapped thickly in waterproof rubber and iron armor. As the ship moves slowly forward, day after day, week after week, it gently unspools the heavy cable over the back of the ship. Down, down, down it falls, through the sunlight of the surface, down into the cool, dark blue, and finally down into the pitch-black, freezing depths of the ocean floor. Imagine that wire resting quietly in the soft mud of the deep ocean trench, surrounded by strange glowing creatures and ancient shipwrecks. It is completely silent down there. The pressure of the water is immense. But inside the tiny copper heart of that heavy resting cable, invisible sparks of human thought are rushing back and forth. Click, clack. Two massive continents, separated by a vast, terrifying ocean, were finally holding hands in the dark. The world shrank. The vast, frightening globe became a single, connected neighborhood. We had tamed the lightning. We had forced it into our copper wires to carry our words. We were the masters of the invisible spark. But as we sat in our homes at night, listening to the comforting, rhythmic tapping of the telegraph, the rooms around us were still illuminated by an ancient, fragile technology. We were still reading those instant messages by the soft, dangerous, flickering light of candles and oil lamps. The flame was beautiful, but it consumed the air. It created heavy soot, and it was always hungry. We looked at the brilliant, sudden flash of the electric spark in the telegraph office, and we began to wonder, what if we didn't just use electricity to speak? What if we could capture that brilliant, clean energy, trap it inside a tiny glass bubble, and freeze it into a steady, warm glow that would push back the shadows forever? Trap it inside a tiny glass bubble and freeze it into a steady, warm glow that would push back the shadows forever? To truly understand the magic of the electric light, we must first remember what the night used to smell like. We must remember the shadows. For thousands of years, ever since our ancient ancestors gathered around that very first campfire, the only way humanity could create light was by burning something. We burned animal fat in hollowed-out stones. We burned thick, heavy wax in the grand halls of castles. And by the time the telegraph wires were humming across the oceans, we were burning kerosene and whale oil in small, fragile glass lamps resting on our wooden tables. But fire is a messy, hungry companion. Imagine sitting in a Victorian living room on a cold winter evening. You are trying to read a newly printed book, or perhaps writing a letter to a distant friend. The oil lamp beside you provides a soft yellow light, but it flickers constantly, casting long, trembling, restless shadows against the walls. The flame hisses softly. It consumes the oxygen in the small room, making the air feel heavy and close. And then there is the soot, a fine, invisible, greasy black dust that slowly coats the ceilings, dulls the colorful wallpaper, and settles quietly into the pages of your books. More than the dirt, there was always the quiet, heavy fear. A single careless movement, a heavy book dropped on a table, a child running too fast, a sudden gust of wind from an open window, could knock the oil lamp to the wooden floor. In an instant, the comforting light could transform into a terrifying, destructive inferno. The night was still dangerous. We had learned to send invisible electrical sparks across the world to carry our messages. We knew that electricity contained immense energy. In the bustling streets of big cities, scientists had already created arc lamps, massive, blindingly bright electric fires that hissed and sparked, illuminating large factories and public squares. But arc lamps were entirely too bright and far too dangerous to bring into a quiet, resting home. They were like keeping a thunderstorm in your living room. We did not need a blinding flash. We needed a whisper of light. We needed to take that immense, roaring electrical river and divide it into millions of tiny, gentle, glowing drops. Let us step out of the cold, snowy night and into a warm, dusty, incredibly quiet laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, in the late 1870s. The room is filled with glass tubes, coils of copper wire, and the sharp smell of chemicals. Here, Thomas Edison and a dedicated team of quiet, patient workers were wrestling with a beautiful, frustrating puzzle. They knew the basic secret. If you push an electrical current through a very thin wire, the wire will resist the energy. It will fight the current. And as it fights, it gets incredibly hot. It gets so hot that it begins to glow. It becomes a filament. The problem was a simple, brutal law of nature. When things get that hot in the open air, they instantly catch fire. They burn up in a sudden, bright flash and then turn to ash. To create a light bulb, they had to defeat fire itself. And to defeat fire, they had to remove the very breath it needed to survive. They had to remove the oxygen. Imagine the delicate, mesmerizing work of the glassblower in the corner of the lab. He takes a long, hollow tube of clear glass. He heats it over a hot flame until the rigid glass turns into a soft, glowing, flexible syrup. With a gentle, perfectly controlled breath, he blows into the tube, expanding the glass into a perfect, fragile, teardrop-shaped bubble. Inside this beautiful glass bubble, the team placed the tiny filament. Then, they connected the bubble to a heavy, rhythmic machine called a vacuum pump. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. For hours, the pump worked, slowly sucking every single molecule of air out of the glass. Inside the bulb, they created an absolute void, a tiny pocket of nothingness, a place where fire simply could not exist. But the hardest part of the puzzle remained. What material could survive the intense burning heat of the electricity, even in a vacuum, without melting or snapping? Imagine the deep, exhausting patience of the men in that room. For months and months, they sat in the dim, flickering light of their gas lamps, testing everything they could find. They tested expensive metals like platinum. It melted. They tested hairs pulled from horses' tails. They burned. They tested fishing line, spider webs, and slivers of wood. They tested thousands of materials. And thousands of times, the glass bulb flashed brightly for a few seconds, and then went black. The darkness kept winning. But true genius is simply patience pushed to its absolute limit. In October of 1879, Edison's team decided to try something entirely ordinary, a simple, cheap piece of sewing cotton thread. Listen to the quiet, delicate process. They took the soft cotton thread and packed it carefully into a mold. They baked it in a scorching hot furnace for hours, baking away everything soft, leaving behind only a fragile, brittle, pure black skeleton of carbon. It was so delicate that if a worker breathed on it too heavily, it would shatter into dust. With incredibly steady hands, holding their breath, they mounted the tiny black thread inside the glass bubble. They pumped the air out. They sealed the glass tight. It was late in the evening. The laboratory was completely silent. The men gathered around the small, fragile glass teardrop resting on the wooden table. Someone reached out and gently turned the heavy brass switch. Click. Instantly, the invisible electrical current rushed through the copper wires and into the tiny, fragile carbon thread. The thread fought the current. It grew hot. But because there was no air inside the glass, it did not catch fire. It did not turn to ash. Instead, it began to glow. A soft, warm, beautiful golden light blossomed inside the glass. It pushed out against the shadows, illuminating the tired, amazed faces of the men standing around the table. It did not flicker. It did not hiss. There was no smell of smoke, and there was no falling soot. It was completely, perfectly steady. A piece of captive sunlight resting quietly on a wooden desk. They sat down and they watched it. They waited for the inevitable pop. They waited for the darkness to return. 1 hour passed. The bulb continued to glow with a quiet, stubborn grace. 2 hours. 10 hours. They sat through the entire night, watching the tiny, glowing thread. When the morning sun finally rose and poured its cold blue light through the snowy windows of the laboratory, the little glass bulb was still burning. The night had finally been conquered. The invention of the practical, long-lasting light bulb changed the rhythm of human life forever. The gentle yellow glow spread outward from that laboratory, creeping along newly laid copper wires, lighting up the streets of the great cities. People no longer had to rush home when the sun dipped below the horizon. The dark, terrifying alleys of the city became safe, illuminated pathways. Factories could run smoothly and safely into the evening, and inside the quiet homes, families could sit in their living rooms, reading, talking, and laughing, bathed in a clean, warm light that never threatened to burn their houses down. We had pushed back the ancient darkness. We had filled our rooms with a beautiful, steady, golden light. And as we sat in our brightly lit rooms, looking at the familiar faces of our families and the cherished objects in our homes, a new desire began to quietly form. Light is a magnificent thing. It bounces off the world, enters our eyes, and paints a picture in our minds. But a memory, even a well-lit one, fades. We looked at the perfect, crisp shadows cast by our new electric bulbs, and we began to wonder, what if we didn't just use the light to see? What if we could catch the light, trap the shadows it created, and freeze a single beautiful moment of time onto a piece of paper, so it would never, ever fade away. What if we could catch the light, trap the shadows it created, and freeze a single beautiful moment of time onto a piece of paper, so it would never, ever fade away? To understand the profound miracle of the photograph, we must first think about the fragile nature of human memory. Before we learned to freeze the light, the only way to capture the image of a human face was through the slow, expensive stroke of an artist's brush. Kings and queens could pay master painters to mix oils and pigments, spending weeks sitting perfectly still while their likeness was copied onto a heavy canvas. But for the vast, overwhelming majority of humanity, this was an impossible luxury. If you were a farmer, a merchant, or a sailor, your face belonged only to the present moment. Imagine the deep, quiet ache of a mother whose child had grown up and moved far away, or the heavy heart of a husband who had lost his wife to the passage of time. They had no physical image to hold on to. They had to rely entirely on their own minds. They would close their eyes in the dark, trying desperately to remember the exact curve of a smile, or the specific, gentle shape of a loved one's eyes. But memory is like water. It slowly slips away. The details blur, the edges soften, and eventually, the face you loved more than anything in the world becomes a ghost, a shadow that you can no longer clearly see. We had tamed the massive oceans, and we had forced electricity to speak across the continents. But we were still helpless against the slow erasing of time. The secret to defeating time was not found in a machine. It was found in the quiet, ancient magic of the sun and the strange, sensitive chemistry of the earth. For hundreds of years, artists and scientists knew a beautiful secret about light. It was called the camera obscura, the dark room. If you sit in a room that is completely, absolutely pitch black, and you pierce one tiny, perfectly round hole in the wall facing the bright outside world, something miraculous happens. The light from the sun bounces off the trees, the clouds, and the houses outside. It travels in perfectly straight lines. Those lines squeeze through the tiny hole in your dark room, and they project an image onto the wall behind you. It is a perfect, moving, full-color projection of the world outside, playing silently, upside down, on the dark wall. It was a mesmerizing parlor trick. Artists would use small, portable wooden boxes with a lens at the front to project these images onto paper, so they could easily trace the perfectly accurate outlines of a city or a landscape. But tracing was just copying. The light was doing the work, but the moment you moved the box, the image vanished. The magic disappeared. We needed the light to paint its own picture, and we needed the paper to hold on to it. Let us step into a small, dark laboratory in France in the early 1800s. The air here does not smell of burning coal or hot iron. It smells sharp, chemical, and slightly metallic. It smells of iodine, ether, and silver. Here, early pioneers like Nicéphore Niès and Louis Daguerre were experimenting with a completely new kind of alchemy. They had noticed that certain chemicals, like silver nitrate, reacted violently when exposed to the sun. If you left them in the dark, they remained pure white. But the moment the sunlight touched them, they bruised, they darkened, they turned a deep, permanent black. This was the key. Imagine the incredibly delicate, precise preparation for one of the very first photographs. A heavy, highly polished plate of silver-coated copper is taken into a completely dark room. The craftsman treats the metal with strange, glowing vapors of iodine, making the surface highly sensitive to light. He places this fragile, invisible canvas inside a heavy wooden box, the camera. He covers the lens with a thick brass cap. Then, he carries the heavy wooden box out into the bright, blinding sunlight of a dusty city street. He points the camera at a stone building. He pulls his pocket watch from his vest. He reaches out and gently removes the brass cap from the lens. Click. The camera is open. Inside the heavy wooden box, the bright light of the sun rushes through the glass lens. It hits the sensitive silver plate, where the light is incredibly bright. The white clouds, the pale stone, the chemicals react fiercely, turning dark. Where the shadows rest, the dark windows, the deep doorways, the chemicals do not change. The light is slowly, silently carving its own perfect reflection into the metal. But this ancient light was weak. It took a very, very long time to burn the image into the plate. Imagine being one of the first human beings ever asked to sit for a photograph. You are placed in a wooden chair under the bright, blazing sun. The photographer tells you that you must not move. You cannot speak. You cannot smile. You must not even blink too heavily. If you move even a fraction of an inch, your face will become a blurry, faceless ghost on the final plate. To help you stay perfectly still, the photographer brings out a heavy iron stand. He places it behind your chair and gently tightens a cold metal clamp around the back of your neck. You must sit there, frozen like a marble statue, staring unblinking into the dark glass eye of the wooden box for 3, 4, sometimes 5 agonizing minutes. It was an endurance test. It was an absolute submission to stillness. When the time is finally up, the photographer covers the lens. The magic is done. But it is still invisible. The silver plate must be brought back into the absolute darkness of the chemical room to be awakened. Listen to the quiet, sloshing sounds of the dark room. The air is thick. The only light comes from a very dim, deep red lantern, because red light does not hurt the fragile chemicals. The photographer carefully removes the silver plate from the wooden box. It looks completely blank. He slides it gently into a shallow glass tray filled with a clear, harsh-smelling liquid. He gently rocks the tray back and forth. Swish, swish, swish. And then, you watch the impossible happen. Slowly, like a spirit rising through deep water, shadows begin to form on the blank metal. Dark lines appear. Then, the softer shades of grey. The image climbs out of the nothingness, the texture of a wool coat, the exact curl of a strand of hair, and finally, the sharp, clear, unmistakable reflection of a human eye. The liquid is washed away, and the image is permanently fixed. It will never change again. Imagine the overwhelming, breathtaking emotion of holding that cool, heavy piece of metal in your hands for the very first time. You are holding a mirror that has a memory. You are looking at a single, isolated fraction of a second, pulled out of the river of time and frozen forever into a solid object. The photograph democratized memory. Suddenly, it was not just kings who could be remembered. A poor farmer could save his pennies and have his portrait taken. A young soldier, boarding a heavy steam train to fight in a terrifying distant war, could carry a small tin photograph of his wife resting in the breast pocket of his uniform, directly over his heart. When the nights were cold and lonely, he could pull it out, look at her face, and know exactly what she looked like. We had learned to defeat the fading of the mind. We had captured the light. But as we sat in our armchairs, staring deeply into the sepia-toned eyes of our distant families on those small paper cards, a quiet, melancholic realization washed over us. The photograph was a miracle, but it was completely, profoundly silent. We could see the gentle curve of our mother's smile, but we could not hear her laugh. We could look at the face of a distant friend, but the heavy, quiet miles between us still felt impossibly wide. The telegraph could send the clicking dots and dashes of words, but it could not carry the warmth, the tone, or the comforting breath of a human voice. We looked at the copper wires stretching across the silent landscapes, and we began to dream of teaching the invisible electricity how to sing. To understand the miracle of the telephone, we must first think about what a voice truly is. A human voice is not simply a collection of words. It is an instrument of pure, unfiltered emotion. When you hear a mother whisper a lullaby to a sleeping child, or when you hear the sudden bursting laugh of an old friend, you are not just receiving information. You are feeling their presence. The telegraph was a brilliant invention, but it was cold. It could easily spell out the letters of the word joy or sorrow, but a clicking brass key could never capture the trembling warmth behind those letters. The telegraph was a machine built for the mind. We needed a machine built for the heart. Sound, at its very core, is deeply physical. When we speak, we push warm air up from our lungs. That air rushes past the tiny, delicate folds of our vocal cords, making them vibrate. These vibrations send invisible, rolling waves of pressure out into the room. These ripples wash over the listener, gently tapping against the paper-thin drum hidden deep inside their ear. Hearing is a form of touching. It is an intimate connection, even from across a room. The magnificent puzzle of the 19th century was this: how do you capture that physical ripple of air and pack it into a solid, cold copper wire? Step into a crowded, dusty workshop in Boston in the year 1876. The air is heavy with the scent of melted wax, battery acid, and hot metal. Here, Alexander Graham Bell, a man who spent his life teaching deaf students how to speak, was wrestling with the geometry of sound. He understood the human ear better than almost anyone. He studied how a fragile membrane, no thicker than a piece of silk, could catch the heavy vibrations of the air. He wondered, what if we could build a mechanical ear? Picture a small, wooden cone. Stretched incredibly tight across the narrow end is a piece of parchment, much like the skin of a drum. Attached to the very center of this parchment is a tiny, sharp needle, resting gently in a small metal cup filled with acidic water. A continuous stream of electrical current flows through the liquid and the needle, traveling out into a long wire. When a person speaks into the wide end of the wooden cone, their voice pushes against the parchment. The parchment trembles. It vibrates in perfect harmony with the sound. As it trembles, it pushes the tiny needle up and down in the acid. This tiny dancing motion changes the flow of the electricity. It sculpts the current. The steady, silent river of electrical energy is suddenly shaped into the exact rhythm, pitch, and tone of the human voice. The sound wave is transformed into an electrical wave. Miles away, at the very end of that long copper wire, the magic happens in reverse. The pulsing electricity rushes into an electromagnet, which pulls on another thin round sheet of metal. Vibrate, tremble, push. The metal disc shakes the air in the room, and the air reaches a waiting human ear. Think about that legendary afternoon in March. Bell is standing in his laboratory, exhausted from months of failure. He is adjusting the delicate equipment when he accidentally spills battery acid on his trousers. In a moment of sudden panic, he speaks loudly into the wooden transmitter. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." Down the hall, in a completely separate room with the doors closed tight, his assistant Thomas Watson is resting his ear against a strange wooden receiver. Suddenly, the solid block of wood speaks. It does not click. It does not ring. It carries the panicked, distinct, unmistakable voice of his friend. The metal has learned to sing. Watson drops the receiver and runs down the hall, bursting into the room to confirm the impossible. The barrier of silence had been broken. This quiet breakthrough fundamentally changed the texture of human loneliness. Before the telephone, saying goodbye to someone meant stepping into a vast void of silence. If a family member moved to a different city, you might have to wait weeks for a paper letter to arrive, just to know they were safe. The world felt impossibly huge. But soon, tall wooden poles carrying dozens of thin wires began to weave through the streets of the cities, connecting homes like a massive, invisible spiderweb. Consider the profound physical comfort of making a call in those early days. You did not simply press a button. You walked up to a heavy wooden box mounted on the wall of your hallway. You lifted a heavy black receiver to your ear. With your other hand, you turned a small metal crank on the side of the box. Grint, 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 grint. This spinning crank sent a jolt of electricity down the street to a central exchange building. There, in a large, quiet room, a glowing light would appear on a massive board of sockets. A calm, polite operator would plug a headset in and ask, "Number, please." You would speak the name of your friend or their designated number. The operator would take a thick, woven cord and physically push a metal plug into a hole on the board, literally tying your house to theirs. It was a beautiful web of human hands, weaving the voices of the world together. Suddenly, outside your window, a freezing winter storm could be raging. The snow could be piling up, blocking the roads and keeping everyone trapped inside. But you could stand in your warm hallway, holding the heavy receiver, and hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of someone you love. You could hear the hesitation before they spoke. You could hear the smile hiding in their words. Distance was no longer an absolute barrier to intimacy. The world became a global living room, filled with whispered conversations, shared secrets, and the comforting reassurance of a familiar voice. We had conquered the massive oceans with our ships. We had illuminated the dark nights with our glowing glass bulbs. We had frozen our memories onto silver plates, and now we could reach out and touch anyone, anywhere, with just the ringing of a bell. But while our voices could fly at the speed of light, our bodies were still heavy. We were still tied to the slow, exhausting rhythm of the horse, or the rigid, unbending iron tracks of the steam train. The locomotive was incredibly powerful, but it could only take you to the station. It could not take you to your front door. It could not wander off the path to explore a quiet forest or a hidden valley. We looked at the dusty, winding dirt roads stretching out across the vast landscapes, and we began to dream of a machine that could give us the absolute wandering freedom of a bird. Freedom of a bird. For thousands of years, to travel across the solid earth meant forming a quiet partnership with a living creature. If you wanted to cross a vast meadow, climb a winding mountain pass, or simply visit a neighboring village, you had to rely on the broad, breathing chest of a horse or the slow, steady plodding of an ox. These animals were beautiful, loyal companions, but they were made of flesh and bone, just like us. They grew tired. They felt the heavy, beating heat of the midday sun, and they shivered in the bitter winds of winter. After a few hours of pulling a heavy wooden carriage, a horse needed to rest. It needed cool water, fresh oats, and a quiet stable. Because we relied on living muscle, the world remained a very large, very slow place. We had, of course, built the magnificent steam trains. Those roaring beasts of iron and fire could pull hundreds of people across a continent in a matter of days. But the train was a rigid master. Think about the feeling of standing on a wooden railway platform. You're holding a paper ticket, waiting for a machine that runs on a strict, unbending schedule. When the train finally arrives, hissing and breathing heavy clouds of white steam, you step inside a metal box with strangers. You do not control the speed. You do not choose the direction. The locomotive can only travel where the heavy iron rails have been laid. It cannot leave the track to explore a beautiful hidden lake or take a sudden turn down a quiet, shaded forest path. The train takes you to the station, but it cannot take you home. Humanity was moving faster than ever before, but we were passengers. We wanted to be the captains of our own journeys. We longed for a machine that had the tireless, endless stamina of the steam locomotive, but the gentle, wandering flexibility of a saddled horse. The secret to this absolute freedom was hiding in a completely new kind of fire. The steam engine was massive because the fire burned on the outside, boiling a huge reservoir of water. To make a machine small enough to fit inside a personal carriage, engineers had to figure out how to put the fire inside the metal itself. Step into a small, oily workshop in Germany in the late 19th century. The air smells sharp and rich, a completely new scent in the history of the world. It is the smell of refined liquid petroleum, gasoline. Here, brilliant minds like Carl Benz were crafting a masterpiece of hidden rhythmic violence: the internal combustion engine. Instead of boiling water, this engine breathed in a tiny mist of liquid fuel and fresh air. It trapped that mist inside a small, heavy metal cylinder. Then, a tiny electric spark, a microscopic flash of lightning, ignited the mist. Bang! It was a tiny, enclosed explosion. The force of that explosion pushed a heavy metal piston downward. And the genius of the machine was that it did this over and over and over again. Hundreds of times a minute. Bang, 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 bang. It was a pocket-sized volcano. By trapping those thousands of tiny explosions inside a heavy iron block, the chaotic power of fire was instantly transformed into a smooth, spinning, continuous motion. Picture the very first time one of these machines was brought out into the sunlight. It did not look like the cars we know today. It looked like a delicate, three-wheeled carriage, built with thin bicycle tires and a wooden bench. There was no horse standing in front of it. There was just empty space. To bring the machine to life required a physical connection. A driver would stand at the front or the side of the carriage, holding a heavy metal crank attached directly to the engine. With a deep breath, they would pull the crank upward, using their own muscle to force the engine to take its very first breath of fuel and air. Listen to the sound of it waking up. A heavy, metallic cough, a sputter, and then a sudden, deep, rhythmic thrumming. The whole wooden carriage began to shake slightly, humming with the invisible power of the contained fire. The engine was alive. The driver climbed up onto the leather seat. They grasped a wooden tiller, much like the steering pole of a small boat. They engaged a heavy leather belt to connect the spinning engine to the wheels. And then, the carriage moved, all by itself. There was no sound of hooves striking the dirt. There was only the steady, popping rhythm of the exhaust and the soft crunch of the thin rubber tires rolling over the gravel. As the carriage gathered speed, a cool breeze washed over the driver's face. It was a feeling of profound, dizzying independence. You could turn the wooden handle to the left, and the machine instantly obeyed. You could turn it to the right, and the wheels followed. You did not have to feed it apples. You did not have to let it sleep. As long as there was a splash of amber liquid in the brass tank, the mechanical horse would run forever. At first, these sputtering, shaking motor cars were simply expensive toys for the very rich. They were rare, loud, and prone to breaking down on the muddy, unpaved roads. But soon, a man named Henry Ford looked at the automobile and realized that freedom should not be a luxury. He organized vast, beautifully choreographed factories. Instead of a team of men building one car over a month, the car moved slowly down a long line, and each worker added just one single part. It was a flowing river of steel, rubber, and glass. Because they were built so efficiently, the price plummeted. Suddenly, a humble farmer could afford to buy a black, shiny Model T. A schoolteacher could own a mechanical carriage. The world was fundamentally rewritten by the spinning rubber wheel. The old, muddy horse paths were smoothed out and paved with dark, smooth asphalt, creating ribbons of black stone that stretched across the continents. The quiet isolation of the rural countryside vanished. A family living on a distant farm could wake up on a Saturday morning, climb into their car, and simply drive into the bustling city to see a moving picture show, returning home to sleep in their own beds that very same night. The automobile gave us the weekend. It gave us the road trip. It transformed travel from a heavy, difficult burden of survival into an act of pure, joyful leisure. Consider the sensory poetry of driving down a long, open road in the late afternoon. The sun is beginning to set, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The windows are rolled down. You can feel the warm wind rushing through your hair. The engine hums a low, comforting, steady note beneath your feet. You grip the smooth circle of the steering wheel, feeling the gentle vibration of the road, translating directly into your hands. You look out at the horizon, and it is no longer a barrier. It is an open door. You can go anywhere. The earth will let you. You are completely, blissfully free. We had paved the ground. We had conquered the massive continents with our turning wheels. From the deepest valleys to the highest mountain passes, the earth belonged to us. But humanity has always been infected with a beautiful, restless sickness. We are never satisfied. As we drove our metal carriages along the edges of the high cliffs, we looked out the windows. We watched the hawks catching the invisible thermals, gliding effortlessly in circles above the clouds. We looked down at the dirt, and we realized that the wheel, for all its magnificent freedom, was still a chain. It still held us to the ground. To find the ultimate freedom, to truly break the ancient rules of the world, we had to figure out how to let go of the earth completely. To truly break the ancient rules of the world, we had to figure out how to let go of the earth completely. For as long as humanity has possessed the ability to look upward, we have harbored a deep, quiet envy of the sky. Gravity is the oldest, most relentless master we have ever known. From the moment we take our very first childhood steps, we feel its invisible, heavy hand pulling us down, keeping our feet firmly planted in the dust. When an ancient farmer rested his tired hands on a wooden plow and watched a hawk trace lazy, silent circles in the high summer air, he did not just see a bird. He saw absolute, untouched freedom. The hawk did not care about the jagged, rocky mountains. It did not care about the deep, rushing rivers or the thick, tangled forests that made human travel so agonizingly slow. The bird simply glided over them all, using the invisible currents of the wind as its own private highway. For centuries, we desperately tried to steal that magic. Brilliant artists and engineers drew magnificent sweeping sketches of massive flapping wings made of light wood and silk. Brave, foolish dreamers strapped homemade feathers to their arms and leapt from the tops of high stone towers, only to be violently reminded that human bones are heavy and the air is painfully thin. We learned to float eventually. We filled massive envelopes of beautiful silk with hot air or light gases, drifting slowly and peacefully beneath giant balloons. It was a completely silent, breathtaking way to see the world from above. But a balloon is a captive of the breeze. It goes wherever the wind decides to push it. It is not true flying. It is simply floating. To truly conquer the sky, we needed to steer. We needed to push our way through the air with intention and purpose. The secret was waiting for us, hiding in the spinning wheels of the motor car. We finally had a mechanical heart, the internal combustion engine, that was strong enough to create a powerful, continuous rhythm. But the heavy iron engines of the early automobiles were much too dense. If you strapped them to a set of wings, they would simply drag the machine straight back into the dirt. We had to strip away the weight. We had to build something impossibly light, yet strong enough to wrestle with the wild wind. Step out onto the cold, desolate, windswept dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, in the very early years of the 20th century. The air here tastes of salt and frozen sand. The wind is relentless. It howls in from the grey Atlantic Ocean, pushing heavily against your winter coat, whistling through the tall beach grass. Resting on the sand is a strange, fragile-looking skeleton. It does not look like a machine of conquest. It looks like a giant, delicate kite. Two quiet, incredibly patient brothers who built bicycles for a living had spent years studying the exact shape of a bird's wing. They noticed that a wing is not perfectly flat. It is gently curved. When the wind rushes over that specific, elegant curve, the air traveling over the top moves just a little bit faster than the air traveling underneath. This tiny, invisible difference in speed creates a soft vacuum above the wing. The air literally reaches down, grabs the fabric, and pulls it upward. This is the quiet miracle of lift. The brothers built their flyer out of the lightest materials they could possibly find. Straight, fragrant spruce wood, strong, woven muslin cloth, stretched incredibly tight over the wooden ribs, and miles of thin, singing piano wire holding it all delicately together. They cast a custom engine block out of aluminum, a metal so light it felt almost like magic. Listen to the sound of that freezing December morning. The wind is whipping across the dunes. One of the brothers lies completely flat on his stomach on the bottom wing, staring straight ahead at the grey horizon. The small aluminum engine is brought to life. Cough, sputter, roar. It is a loud, chaotic rattling noise, completely foreign to the lonely, quiet beach. Two hand-carved wooden propellers, mounted behind the wings, begin to spin. They blur into invisible, humming circles, biting aggressively into the thick sea air, pushing the fragile craft forward along a wooden guiding rail. The machine begins to move. It slides over the sand, gathering speed, 10 feet, 20 feet. The wind catches the tightly stretched muslin cloth. The invisible hands of the air reach down. And then, the heavy, ancient chain of gravity simply snaps. The wheels leave the wooden rail. The rattling, shaking machine does not fall. It rises. It climbs into the freezing air, fighting the wind, completely disconnected from the solid earth. For 12 It was a remarkably short journey, just a little over 100 feet. But in that brief, rattling moment, the heavy ceiling of the human world was shattered forever. The evolution of the airplane happened with dizzying, beautiful speed. The fragile muslin and spruce wood were quickly replaced by gleaming, riveted aluminum. The open, freezing cockpits were enclosed in sleek, warm glass. The rattling little engines grew into massive, roaring turbines that could swallow the sky. Think about the profound sensory shift of flying in a modern passenger plane. You walk down a carpeted tunnel and step into a long, quiet cabin. You sink into a soft, cushioned seat. You hear the deep, rising whine of the jet engines as they build impossible amounts of thrust. The heavy machine accelerates down the long, flat ribbon of concrete, pushing you gently back into your chair. And then the nose lifts. The rumbling vibrations of the spinning wheels suddenly vanish. The ride becomes incredibly, miraculously smooth. You look out the small, oval window. The buildings, the winding highways, and the vast, crawling cities shrink into tiny, silent geometric patterns. You climb higher, piercing through the thick, grey ceiling of the rain clouds, and suddenly, you emerge into a world of eternal, blinding sunlight. You are cruising through a calm, blue void, looking down at a vast, fluffy ocean of brilliant white clouds. The airplane completely erased the meaning of distance. A treacherous ocean crossing that once took a heavy wooden ship 3 terrifying, storm-tossed weeks could now be crossed in a single, quiet night. While the passengers slept softly under thin blankets, we could wake up in Paris, watch the sunset over New York, and never once feel the mud of the road beneath our feet. We had conquered the massive macro world. We had mapped the continents, crossed the oceans, and finally claimed the boundless sky. We were the masters of everything we could see. But as we flew high above the earth, safe and warm in our aluminum birds, an invisible, ancient enemy was still fighting a quiet, devastating war against us down on the ground. A war that took place not on battlefields, but in quiet hospital beds and darkened bedrooms. We had learned to see the massive craters of the moon with our glass lenses. Now, we needed to turn those lenses downward into the microscopic world, to find a tiny, quiet weapon that could save millions of lives. To find a tiny, quiet weapon that could save millions of lives. To truly grasp the miracle of modern medicine, we must first look at the terrifying fragility of the past. By the early 20th century, human beings had become titans. We had mapped the stars, laid heavy iron tracks across the vast continents, and built roaring machines that could carry us above the clouds. We felt incredibly strong. We felt invincible. But this strength was an illusion. Down on the ground, in the quiet, shadowed corners of our homes and hospitals, we were still losing a silent, ancient war. For the vast majority of our history, the greatest threat to a human life was not a massive predator or a terrible storm. It was something so unimaginably small that it could rest comfortably on the point of a needle. Bacteria. Picture the deep, heavy anxiety of a parent sitting by a child's bed just 100 years ago. A simple afternoon playing in the garden could lead to a scraped knee. A farmer working in the fields might get a tiny, sharp splinter of wood caught in his hand. A tailor could accidentally prick a finger with a sewing needle. Today, we wash these tiny wounds, place a small bandage over them, and forget they ever happened. But back then, the skin was our only fortress. Once that wall was broken, the invisible enemy rushed in. A small red scratch would slowly begin to swell. It would grow hot to the touch. The heat would spread, creeping up the arm or the leg, carrying a deep, throbbing ache. And then, the fever would set in. There was no pill to swallow. There was no injection to stop the invisible army from multiplying inside the blood. Doctors, despite all their heavy books and glass instruments, could only stand by the bed, place cool, damp cloths on the patient's burning forehead, and wait. The sick room was a place of agonizing, ticking silence. You simply had to hope that the human body could fight the war on its own. Often, it could not. Millions of lives were cut short by the smallest, most quiet wounds. We had mastered the earth, but we were completely helpless against the microscopic world. We needed a defender, and strangely enough, we did not invent this defender in a fiery furnace or build it out of heavy steel. We grew it, or rather, we accidentally let it grow. Let us step into a cluttered, dusty laboratory in London in the late summer of 1928. The room belongs to a brilliant but wonderfully messy scientist named Alexander Fleming. His wooden benches are covered in a chaotic landscape of small, round glass dishes. These are petri dishes, filled with a thick, jelly-like substance called agar, designed to feed and grow dangerous bacteria for study. Fleming had been studying a particularly fierce strain of bacteria, the kind that caused terrible throat infections and boils. But the air in London was turning warm, and he was tired. He decided to leave his laboratory for a long, restful month of vacation in the countryside. He did not clean his desk. He simply closed the door, leaving the glass dishes sitting in the quiet, dim room. While he was gone, a very small, completely ordinary event took place. A tiny, invisible spore floated through the cool, damp air of the laboratory. It drifted slowly downward, eventually landing softly inside one of the unsealed glass dishes. When Fleming finally returned from his rest, he began the tedious chore of cleaning up his old experiments. He picked up the glass dishes one by one, looking at the cloudy yellow colonies of bacteria growing inside, and dropped them into a tub of cleaning acid. But as he picked up one specific dish, he stopped. He held it up to the light of the window. Something strange had happened. The tiny, invisible spore that had drifted through the air had blossomed into a fuzzy blue-green patch of mold. It looked exactly like the soft mold you might find on an old piece of bread left too long in a dark cupboard. But the miracle was not the mold itself. The miracle was the empty space around it. The dangerous yellow bacteria covered the entire glass dish, except for a wide, perfectly clear, completely empty ring surrounding the blue-green fuzz. It was a halo of absolute safety. The mold, struggling to survive in the crowded dish, was quietly sweating out a natural, invisible juice, a chemical defense. And this juice was an absolute, devastating poison to the bacteria. Wherever the juice touched the bacteria, the invisible enemy simply dissolved. They popped like tiny balloons. Fleming had discovered penicillin. It was not a roaring machine. It was a silent chemical whisper from the earth itself. It took many more years, and the brilliant, tireless work of other dedicated chemists, to learn how to collect this juice, purify it, and turn it into a medicine that a human being could safely take. But when they finally succeeded, the effect on the human world was nothing short of miraculous. Think about the profound physical relief of a fever finally breaking. A patient is lying in a hospital bed, their skin burning, their breathing shallow and rapid. The invisible infection is raging. A doctor steps quietly into the room, holding a small glass syringe filled with a clear, golden liquid. A tiny pinch of the needle, and the medicine is sent rushing into the bloodstream. Inside the body, the microscopic war instantly turns. The penicillin floods the system, locking onto the walls of the dangerous bacteria, weakening them, destroying them by the millions. Within just a few hours, the heavy, suffocating heat begins to lift. The patient's breathing slows down, becoming deep and regular. A cool, comforting sweat breaks out across their forehead. The sharp, throbbing pain begins to fade into a dull, distant memory. They close their eyes, and for the first time in days, they fall into a deep, peaceful, healing sleep. When they wake up, the danger is gone. The simple scratch is just a scratch again. The invention of antibiotics completely rewrote the timeline of a human life. The quiet, terrifying shadow that had hung over every childhood's scraped knee, every small cut, and every cough was suddenly bathed in light. We no longer had to live in constant fear of the invisible world. Our lives grew longer. We grew healthier. We survived illnesses that would have wiped out entire ancient cities. We had finally secured our bodies against the hidden dangers of the earth. We had bought ourselves time. Beautiful, long, healthy decades of time. And as we lived longer, and as the heavy burdens of survival were lifted from our shoulders, our homes became places of true rest. We could sit in our comfortable armchairs in the evening, bathed in the warm, steady glow of the electric light bulb, knowing our families were safe from the ancient fevers. But as we sat in that safe, warm glow, the living room felt just a little too quiet. The telegraph could send a message across the ocean, and the telephone could carry a voice down the street, but they both required heavy, physical copper wires. We looked at the empty air filling the room. We knew the air could carry the invisible spores of medicine and the invisible pull of gravity. And we began to wonder, could the empty air also carry a song? Could we reach out into the silent, invisible waves of the night and pull music down from the sky? Could the empty air also carry a song? Could we reach out into the silent, invisible waves of the night and pull music down from the sky? To appreciate the absolute magic of the radio, we must first look at the heavy physical limits we had built for ourselves. The telegraph and the telephone were brilliant, world-changing miracles. But they were tethered. They were chained to the earth by thousands of miles of heavy copper wire, wrapped in rubber and strung up on tall wooden poles. If you lived in a bustling city, the web of wires covered your street like a canopy. But the world is vast, and much of it is completely untamed. Consider a heavy steel ship plunging through the dark, freezing waves of the North Atlantic Ocean in the dead of winter. The closest shoreline is 1,000 miles away. You cannot drag a copper wire behind a ship. Before the turn of the 20th century, the moment a vessel sailed over the grey horizon and lost sight of the land, it stepped into an absolute, terrifying void of silence. If a sudden, violent storm tore the sails, or if the heavy hull struck a hidden reef of ice, the sailors were completely alone. They could not call for help. The ocean simply swallowed their voices. We needed a way to speak without strings. We needed to untie our words from the heavy copper and let them fly completely free. The secret was already surrounding us. It had been there since the very dawn of time. The air in your quiet bedroom feels perfectly still. It feels empty. But if you could suddenly see the world as the universe sees it, you would realize that the space around you is boiling with invisible, overlapping ripples of energy. When you throw a heavy stone into a perfectly calm glass-like pond, you watch the circular waves ripple outward, traveling gently across the surface of the water until they reached the distant shore. Brilliant scientists realized that electricity could do the exact same thing, but the pond was the invisible electromagnetic field of the Earth itself. If you created a sudden, powerful spark of electricity on top of a hill, it sent an invisible shockwave rolling out into the atmosphere, traveling in every direction at the absolute speed of light. Let us travel to a cold, windy hilltop in Italy, just before the turn of the century. A young inventor named Guglielmo Marconi is standing near a strange collection of batteries and metal antennas. He presses down on a simple telegraph key. Crack! A bright, violent spark of electricity jumps between two metal spheres. Far away, hidden entirely behind a large, solid hill, his assistant is waiting with a small receiving device. There are no wires connecting them. There is a massive mound of earth and rock standing directly in the way. The assistant waits in the silence, and then the small device in his hands begins to click. Tap, tap, tap. The invisible wave had washed right over the hill, traveled through the air, and struck the metal antenna, waking up the receiver. It was a ghost passing through a wall. The heavy chains of the copper wire were finally broken. At first, this wireless telegraphy was just used to send the harsh clicking dots and dashes of Morse code. It was a lifeline for the lonely ships at sea. For the first time, a captain caught in a terrifying fog could tap a key and whisper into the dark, and a station on the distant shore would hear him and whisper back. But humanity does not just want to send warnings. We want to share our art. We want to share our souls. The transition from the harsh click of a spark to the warm, rolling beauty of a human voice required incredible, delicate engineering. We had to learn how to mold those invisible flying waves. Experience the profound shock of a wireless operator on a freezing ship, sailing off the coast of New England on Christmas Eve in the year 1906. He is sitting in a small, dim, freezing cabin. The heavy iron hull of the ship is groaning against the winter waves. He is wearing a heavy pair of leather headphones, listening closely to the hissing static of the atmosphere, waiting for the familiar, sharp clicks of Morse code from the mainland. Suddenly, the static clears. The clicking does not come. Instead, a completely different sound fills his ears. It is smooth. It is sweeping. It is the rich, vibrating, heartbreakingly beautiful sound of a wooden violin, playing the slow, gentle notes of "O Holy Night." The sailor freezes. He presses the headphones tighter against his ears, tears welling up in his eyes. He is hundreds of miles from home, surrounded by a freezing, deadly ocean, and yet a piece of warm human art is falling directly out of the freezing night sky and into his mind. When the song ends, a gentle, calm human voice speaks through the static, wishing the lonely sailors of the world a Merry Christmas. That was the birth of true broadcasting. Within a few short decades, the radio transformed from a vital tool of survival into the beating, glowing heart of the human home. Step into a quiet living room in the 1930s. The evening is dark. The rain is pattering softly against the glass windows. In the corner of the room stands a beautiful, heavy cabinet made of polished walnut wood. It is a piece of fine furniture, standing as proudly as a grandfather clock. A father walks over and turns a heavy ribbed bakelite knob. Click. You do not hear music immediately. The radio must wake up. Inside the wooden cabinet, a row of fragile glass vacuum tubes begins to slowly warm up. They start to glow with a soft, comforting, deep orange light, much like the dying embers of an ancient campfire. You can smell the faint, warm scent of heated dust and electricity. A low, gentle hum fills the room. The father reaches for a second knob, the tuning dial. Behind a small piece of glass, a delicate needle moves slowly across a glowing amber scale, sweeping past the names of distant cities. Listen to the sensory magic of tuning an antique radio. As the needle moves through the empty spaces between the stations, you hear the raw, chaotic sound of the universe. A deep rushing sound, like the ocean, sharp pops of distant lightning strikes, strange, ghostly whistles fading in and out of the ether. And then, the needle locks into place, the static vanishes. The room is suddenly filled with the smooth, velvet voice of a crooner singing a slow jazz ballad, or the booming, confident voice of a storyteller reading a mysterious tale, or the roaring cheer of a massive crowd watching a baseball game in a city 500 miles away. The radio changed the very architecture of our evenings. The family no longer sat in separate corners of the house. They gathered closely around the glowing wooden box. They stared at the woven fabric of the speaker grill exactly as their ancient ancestors had stared into the dancing flames of the first fires. The radio dissolved the walls of the house. It brought the entire, massive globe right into the center of the living room. For the first time in the history of the world, millions of people, separated by vast oceans, towering mountains and endless plains, could sit in the dark and laugh at the exact same joke at the exact same fraction of a second. They could listen to a president offer words of comfort during a terrifying war, feeling as though he was sitting right there in the armchair beside them. We had created a unified heartbeat for humanity. We were sharing our thoughts, our music, and our fears on the invisible, silent waves of the air. We had conquered the massive distances of the earth, the sky, and the microscopic world. We could broadcast a single voice to 50 million resting minds. But broadcasting is a one-way street. The voice speaks, and the millions simply listen in the dark. As the 20th century slowly drew to a close, we began to dream of a different kind of web. We looked at the glowing tubes of the radio and the humming wires of the telephone, and we wondered, what if the listeners could talk back? What if we could build a massive, invisible, glowing library of all human knowledge, where every single mind on Earth could connect, share, and dream together instantly? What if we could build a massive, invisible, glowing library of all human knowledge, where every single mind on Earth could connect, share, and dream together instantly? To understand this final, most profound leap in human connection, we must look back at the beautiful wooden cabinet of the radio. The radio was a miracle of its time. It brought the entire world into the living room. But it was a monologue, a single, powerful voice speaking out into the darkness, while millions of people sat quietly, listening in the shadows. You could hear the distant singer, but the singer could not hear you. You could not ask a question. You could not share your own story. We had learned to broadcast our voices, but humanity, deep down, does not just want to listen. We want to converse. We want to weave our thoughts together. But to build a conversation that could hold the entire globe, we needed something much faster than the human brain. We needed a machine that could think, or at least, a machine that could remember perfectly and calculate at the speed of light. Let us step into a massive, highly secured room in the middle of the 20th century. The air inside this room is freezing cold, constantly chilled by huge industrial fans to keep the machines from melting. There are no smooth glass screens here. There are no quiet, glowing smartphones. Instead, The room is filled with towering heavy metal cabinets, reaching from the floor to the ceiling. This is the mainframe, the early computer. Listen to the sensory rhythm of this mechanical brain. It is not quiet. It is a loud, chaotic symphony of heavy industry. You hear the deep, continuous roar of the cooling fans. You hear the frantic, rhythmic clicking of thousands of physical metal switches flipping open and closed. Clack, clack. You watch the large, heavy wheels of magnetic tape spinning rapidly behind glass doors, stopping violently, and then spinning backward. To speak to this giant, you did not use a keyboard. You used thick, stiff cards of heavy paper. A worker would use a loud, heavy machine to punch perfectly square, tiny holes into the paper. Thump, thump, thump. These holes were a physical language, a language of presence and absence. A hole meant yes, a solid space meant no, 1 and 0. You would feed thousands of these paper cards into the metal mouth of the giant, and the machine would consume them, reading the light shining through the tiny holes, performing massive, complex mathematical equations in a fraction of a second. These machines were brilliant. They helped us chart the exact, incredibly complex mathematical paths required to launch a silver rocket out of the atmosphere and safely land a human being on the pale, dusty surface of the moon. But these massive metal brains were entirely alone. They sat in their freezing, isolated rooms, completely disconnected from one another. A brilliant computer in California could not share its thoughts with a brilliant computer in Massachusetts. We needed to teach these isolated giants how to whisper to each other over the telephone lines. The engineers realized that you could not just send a massive, heavy file down a fragile copper wire all at once. The wire would choke. The secret was to take a piece of information, a document, a picture, a message, and shatter it. They broke the information down into thousands of tiny, invisible, identical puzzle pieces called packets. They threw these millions of tiny pieces into the copper wires. The pieces raced across the country, weaving through different cities, bouncing through different stations, traveling at nearly the speed of light. And when they finally reached the destination computer, the machine caught them all and instantly, perfectly reassembled the puzzle. It was a quiet, invisible magic. At first, this network was just a silent, text-based tool for scientists and the military. It was a cold, efficient web of green letters glowing on dark screens. But humanity is a visual, deeply curious species. We do not just want to read cold data, we want to explore. We want to wander through beautifully illuminated halls of knowledge. We needed a map. We needed a way to make this invisible network look like a place we could actually visit. And so, the World Wide Web was born. It transformed the cold mathematical network into a vast, silent, infinite library. Think back to a quiet evening in the late 1990s. The heavy, beige plastic monitor is resting on a sturdy desk. The room is dark, illuminated only by the soft, flickering glow of the heavy glass screen. You sit down and you click an icon. Listen to the unforgettable, mechanical song of the early internet, the dial-up modem. First, there is the sharp click of the relay, opening the telephone line. Then, the familiar, pure tones of the number being dialed. Beep, boop, beep. A moment of absolute silence. And then, the handshake. A harsh, high-pitched, mechanical screeching. Shh, sheesh. It is a chaotic, abrasive sound. But to anyone who lived through it, it was not noise. It was the sound of a heavy, ancient door slowly creaking open. It was the sound of two machines, miles apart, agreeing to speak. When the static suddenly cut off and the silence returned, you were in. You were no longer just sitting in your quiet bedroom. Your mind had stepped out into the ether. You could move your mouse, click on a blue, underlined word, and instantly, a picture stored on a spinning hard drive in Tokyo would appear on your desk. You could read a news article written 5 minutes ago in London. You could type a message to a stranger in Brazil, and they would answer you before you even had time to take a breath. The heavy, physical boundaries of the Earth simply dissolved. Soon, we grew tired of the heavy beige boxes and the screeching telephone lines. We took the internet and pushed it out into the thin air. We built sleek, smooth rectangles of black glass, no larger than a deck of cards, and we slipped them into our pockets. Today, the internet is no longer a place we visit. It is an invisible, silent ocean of energy that completely surrounds us. It flows through the air of our homes, passes through the walls of our buildings, and reaches deep into the quiet forests. Massive, glowing fiber optic cables made of pure, spun glass rest quietly at the very bottom of the freezing oceans, right next to the rusted, forgotten remains of the old copper telegraph wires. Inside these glass threads, millions of lasers are pulsing billions of times a second, carrying the combined knowledge, art, music, and love of the entire human race across the globe in a heartbeat. We have built a digital reflection of humanity, a vast, glowing, interconnected brain, where every single person on Earth can be a student and a teacher. And so, we come to the end of our very long journey. Take a slow, deep breath in, and let it out. Let the weight of the thousands of years we have traveled wash over you. Think about how far we have come. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, our ancient ancestors huddled together on the dark, freezing plains of the earth. They were terrified of the shadows. They waited in silence for the sun to return. And then, they found the fire. They gathered around the warm, flickering orange light. In that small, glowing circle of safety, they looked at each other's faces. They found comfort. They found community. And they began to share their very first stories. Over the centuries, we took that tiny spark of fire and we used it to reshape the world. We built the heavy wooden wheels to carry our burdens. We forged the plow to open the earth. We caught the invisible wind in our sails, and we listened to the quiet whisper of the magnetic compass to cross the vast, pathless oceans. We crushed old rags to make paper, and we built heavy, creaking wooden presses to multiply our thoughts. We ground clear glass to save our fading sight, and we built ticking iron clocks to tame the chaotic flow of time. We breathed boiling steam into iron lungs, laying heavy steel tracks across the continents. We forced the invisible lightning to speak through copper wires. We trapped a tiny glowing thread inside a glass bubble to finally conquer the night. And we froze the shadows of our loved ones onto silver plates, so we would never forget their faces. We taught the heavy air to sing with the radio, and we built aluminum wings to finally let go of the earth and rise above the clouds. We found a quiet, invisible mold that could heal our sickness. And finally, we took all of our words, all of our music, and all of our dreams, and we wove them into a massive, invisible web of light that covers the entire globe. We are no longer huddled around a tiny, fragile campfire in the wilderness. The entire earth has become the campfire. We are all sitting around it together, connected by the invisible, glowing threads of the internet, sharing our stories in the warm, safe light. We have conquered the darkness, We have conquered the distance. The heavy, exhausting labor of the ancient world is done. You do not need to wander anymore. You do not need to carry a heavy burden. The fire is burning steadily. The night is perfectly safe. It is time to let your mind float on the quiet, invisible waves of the air. It is time to let your shoulders sink deep into the comfort of where you are resting. The story of humanity will continue tomorrow. But for now, the world is perfectly still. Close your eyes. Let the history fade away and find your rest. Good night.